What's good, Ivy Nation? Welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I'm Vince, that's Trevor, that's Brian, and this is Countdown to Kickoff. And we are going to talk about all the college football playoff games that are going to take place here in a few days. And we're going to talk a little bit about the ones that were as well. And, this is the big preview. And so everybody that's on CFB Nation, welcome to this show. And then, of course, all of our friends over at Irish Breakdown, welcome as well. A little Saturday edition. And, a lot of fun. We had 4 games that took place a little over a week ago. They probably weren't what a lot of people thought they might be. Okay, cool. But it's first time for everything. And as Brian and I discussed when we were breaking down those 4 games after they occurred, blowouts happen in the playoff, folks. And why anybody was surprised that might take place is hilarious. But Brian, go ahead. You look like you're ready to roll here.
Here's the issue that I have with this whole conversation that we saw is I'm surprised there were blowouts from the standpoint of when we broke down individual matchups, they were matchups that we thought were going to be more competitive on paper, right? Like that's just SMU versus Penn State was a game that on paper should have been more competitive. Just like Alabama and Clemson in 2018 in the national title game on paper should have been a lot more competitive than 44-16, right? Like just like maybe Oklahoma versus LSU in the semifinals in 2019, maybe on paper looked like it might be more competitive than 63-28, right? Like, so on paper, I expected more competitive football games. I expected, look, I predicted Notre Dame to win by 11. They won by 10. I predicted Texas to win by 14. They won by 14. The other 2 games were blowouts, right? And what's frustrating is the worst blowout of them all was an SEC team, and we had to listen to the whole week them talking about how other SEC teams should have got into the playoff. And it's just really a lazy narrative. I'll use it. I'll use that word lazy. I'll own that word lazy. It's a lazy narrative to take these playoff games and the way they played out, and none of them were competitive. Like, I mean, you could argue the most competitive of them all was the Texas and Clemson game, a game in which Texas led 28-10 at one point in time, and Clemson never led outside of 7-0, right? It was the only time they led. Indiana never led Notre Dame. Tennessee never led Ohio State. SMU never led Penn State, although they had a shot at the beginning to take that early lead. So you have a narrative that you've built up before the games even start about SEC, Bama, this and that, and Indiana doesn't belong, and SMU doesn't belong, and all this other nonsense. Those teams then go get smacked in the first round, and then you just start running off at the mouth about this is why they don't belong, this is why they don't belong. I don't remember them saying that about Alabama in 2018, the way they did about TCU in 2022. I don't remember that conversation happening. I don't remember them saying, see, Oregon didn't belong in the playoff because they got beat by Ohio State 42-20. Oh, and by the way, Florida State didn't belong in the playoff that year either, who lost 59-20 to Oregon. I mean, we have seen every year except 2017, we have seen multiple blowouts in the college football playoff, and that's in the 14 playoff. So it's nothing but agenda-driven narratives. Am I surprised that the specific games were blowouts because I didn't expect to see those blowouts? Yes. Am I surprised that on any given Saturday, a football team can get smacked by another football team? Yes. Just like, randomly saying, just for instance, let's say there's like a really good SEC team that everybody thinks should be in the college football playoff that just late November randomly goes on the road and loses to a 6-7 team by 21. Those kind of things happen, right? So that was my frustrating thing about it is they act like, well, this is the surprise. Guys, when you add 12 teams into the playoff, you're going to add at least half of those teams are not legitimate championship contenders. Somebody on Twitter yesterday made a great point on this. I don't know if it was Nicole Arbach or somebody else, but like there is, just because you aren't a legitimate title contender doesn't mean you don't belong in the playoff. Because if you would have replaced SMU with Alabama, they're not a title contender either. They weren't deserving either. Neither was Ole Miss. They're not a title contender either. Could they maybe have won a game? Maybe, but you don't know that. And that's the frustrating thing about this whole narrative is there's this giant misconception that you think most talented equals best. And most talented team does not equal best team. And for these people like Kirk Herbstreit keep saying, we need to get to 12 best teams. Well, not if you don't know how to properly define best team, because all you're doing is going off most talented. It's the same reason he tried to argue for a 2-loss Ohio State team who got beat by Iowa by over 30. He tried to advocate should be in the college football playoff in 2017. This isn't new for him. He's done this before because he doesn't understand the difference between a talented team and a good team. And that's the frustrating thing about it, but it's all narrative driven. And it's crazy to watch these people tear down their own product. It's absolutely insane to watch them tear down your own, because it's mostly ESPN people doing all the whining about who's in the playoff, which is absolutely nuts. And the Indiana Notre Dame game got huge ratings. Huge ratings. The ratings were exactly what we said they'd be, Trev. I think we were asked this question, and we said it's Ohio State, Ohio State, Tennessee is going to be number 1. Notre Dame and Indiana is going to be number 2, and then there's going to be a big drop-off for the next 2. And that's exactly how it played out. Right? And so
it didn't help they were going up against the NFL.
Right.
Either.
They got the 12 teams right. And then, of course, Indiana, unfortunately, gets pitted against a team that had no business being the 7 seed. That's the other unfortunate thing. That's what happened to them. And so, that's how it played out. But the 4 best teams won. The 4 teams that we thought were going to win all won. The games just weren't as competitive as we thought they would be. And you saw some sloppiness from teams that had 3-week layoffs as well. I think SMU suffered a little bit of that, in my opinion. I think Texas's defense suffered a little bit of that, in my opinion, against Clemson. And that's what we saw in the first round. And guess what, guys? There will be at least 1 or 2 more blowouts before this whole thing is over with, because that's just how it goes. That's how it's been every single year. And it was true in the BCS era as well, guys. We saw it in the BCS era. And Notre Dame getting blown out by Alabama in 2012, Ohio State getting blown out by Florida in 2006 in the national title game, Oklahoma getting blown out by USC in the national title game, and was it 2004, right? Like Florida getting destroyed by Nebraska back in the day. Guys, blowouts in the national title games have happened before the playoff era. That's football. And it's just, some people have forgotten history, like, I don't know, 2 years ago history to drive a narrative, but that's the reality of college football. But at the end of the day, the 4 best teams won. And now we're a lot closer to having the 8 best teams. We're not quite there yet, because I don't think Arizona State's one of the 8 best teams of college football, but they earn the right to be in this conversation by winning the Pac-12 and finishing the year off on a great note. And we're getting closer and closer to the best teams that deserve to be here, and have earned the right to be here, to be in this conversation. And I can't wait to see who truly steps up and who's the best of that group. But that was my big takeaway from the first weekend, Trev, was the 4 best teams won. No one should be surprised that there were blowouts, even if you couldn't necessarily point to which games were going to be blowouts, because the on-paper matchups were not maybe what we thought those games. Like, I don't know any of us saw Tennessee getting blown out by Ohio State. Well, I think we all picked Ohio State. I picked Ohio State. Did you pick? I
picked Tennessee 23-17.
Okay. I was 24-20 Ohio State. Like, we weren't that far off. I don't know anybody saw what happened coming.
No.
So, Trev, do you seeing what happened last week, looking forward to next week with these games, do you see more competitive games? What are you thinking we're going to see here in the next round?
I think it's going to be a little mirrored. I mean, my perception of the first round is the reason why I think it's a little bit, a good bit of what Brian said about like the SEC bias and things like that. One team that I think that continually gets glossed over and like the should have been in the playoff, would have been more competitive, whatever conversation is, like, nobody's talking about Miami. Like Miami was a team that got, pushed down because of a late season loss. And, I look at it more of a conversation of who's the more competitive versus the more deserving. Like IU and SMU 100% deserved to be in the playoffs. The conversations that I will hear out, and like not specific to conference, which is why I bring up Miami, not specific to any of that, is I do think other teams would have been more competitive than what they could have been, because I think Miami could at the very least have gone in and done exactly what SMU did at Penn State, but that doesn't mean they're more deserving. You know what I'm saying? Like SMU played in their conference championship. So that is the one conversation that I'll hear out, but I won't hear it out from the lens of, well, they would have because this is an SEC team. I think one of the biggest reasons for the backlash is that you got from the SMU game and the IU game, but not from the Tennessee game, is because teams like IU and SMU aren't supposed to be here, like not supposed to play on that stage. And that's what it was. That's why nobody talked about Tennessee. Brian, to your point, like all of the teams that you listed out that have gotten blown out in the past, Oregon, you know, who else did you bring up?
Bama,
Florida State, Bama,
Florida
like teams,
State, defending champion Florida State, right?
Right. Notre Dame and the opportunities that they've had in bowl games as well.
Defending champion Bama in 2018.
Right.
Correct. Oklahoma got beat by almost 40 in 2019 with Jalen Hurts, a quarterback, if you guys remember that game. Clemson got blown out by Ohio State in 2020, who then got blown out by Oklahoma or Alabama in 2020. All three of the college football playoff games in 2020 were blowouts. All three of them.
Yep.
Alabama blew out Notre Dame. Ohio State blew out Clemson. Alabama blew out Ohio State. None of them were competitive. None of them.
Yep. And that's the reason what's so frustrating, Brian, to your point about how this has been happening in the playoffs. I don't know why people are surprised. It's because it happened to two teams that weren't supposed to be here. Clemson also lost by double digits. Nobody's calling that a blowout. Tennessee got smacked by what, 25, 28?
And it wasn't even that close.
No.
Right.
It was never that close on paper, but nobody's talking about it being a blowout. One, because yes, it's the SEC fans got extremely quiet after that happened. But two, it's because it's a big name school. Like people looked at the program, not the team specifically. So unfortunately, the way that I see this round playing out, it's going to be more of the same because you have Boise State and Arizona State in there. And if those games end up being not close, I don't look at it as taking it away from the season that Boise State and Arizona State had. I love Arizona State's story. Just in the same way that I don't think it takes away from SMU or Indiana what happened to them in the first round of the playoffs. But the narrative is going to be, well, see, these are programs that don't belong and they made it because of the automatic bids and all this other stuff. And it's like, but like they earned the automatic bid.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I do think it's going to be more of the same. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to me if the two most competitive games in the playoffs are the Rose Bowl and the Sugar Bowl. But you know, who knows? I mean, I was texting Brian on whatever day the first round of the games were, Saturday. And I was like, I didn't have it on my bingo sheet that Clemson and Texas was going to be the most competitive game because we were talking in the kickoff show when Sean was on with us that we were like, yeah, this is kind of the one that, you know, we just don't think Clemson has the horses to compete. And it was a little back and forth there for a little bit. Texas started to stretch their legs, and what we had predicted eventually came true. Clemson didn't have enough of the horses to stop. But, excuse me, I mean, that's, Vince, to answer your question, I think that's kind of what it's going to look like is, you know, if Penn State beats Boise State and Texas beats Arizona State, it's going to be more of that narrative of, you know, that's when people start getting real loud about, well, why wasn't Bama in it? Ole Miss could have done that. Like, why? Like the team that my point is the team that nobody's talking about is Miami, the favorite to win the ACC up until like week 10. You know, so I think it's weird that team gets glossed over, and that's where the conference bias comes in. But yeah, I could see it being more the same.
But it's all a guess, right, Trevor? Like you said, okay, maybe Miami's more competitive. Maybe Penn State would have beat Miami worse than SMU. We don't know. And that's at least a fair conversation to have is would they have been more competitive? But the reality is Miami, which you said, I'm back, didn't earn the right to be there. They had a chance to be there. If they simply beat Syracuse, they're there. If they simply beat Georgia Tech, they're there. Just one of those two, and they're in. They're in because they're in the ACC title game, and even if they lost to Clemson, they're in. Right? Same thing with Ole Miss. Hey, here's a thought. Don't lose to 7-5 Florida. Alabama, if they simply beat 6-6, now 6-7 Oklahoma, they're in. Right? But at the end of the day, we don't know that Bama would have been more competitive against Notre Dame than Indiana. We don't know that. We could talk about it, and it's fun to talk. And there's nothing wrong with that. What bothers me and what I went off about the other day was this notion that people disrespect Indiana and SMU by saying they didn't belong there. Yes, they did. And if next year you have 8 blue bloods in the first round, there's going to be a couple blowouts. There just is, because that happens every single year. There's going to be that. And it took away from what I thought was otherwise. There's some great storylines they could have had from that first week that were lost because they focused so much time and attention on that BS narrative. And we didn't get a chance to talk about like, hey guys, do you realize this is the most like meaningful game Penn State has played in a very long time? This is the first time Penn State's been on it played in a game where a championship was on the line since like the 90s, right? Remember the year they went undefeated and like what was it, 94? If another bowl game plays out differently, maybe they're that's the last time Penn State's played for a championship like this. You know, you have this historic venue at Notre Dame Stadium. You've got Texas back on the stage against Clemson, right? An ascending power against a descending power. You know, you've got these great potential storylines. Ohio State is the only one that they've talked about because that they had to sell how great Ohio State looked because that's the only way they could kind of cover up for how bad Tennessee looked. Is it was like, why wasn't the narrative about how well Notre Dame played? Why wasn't that the narrative as opposed to Indiana didn't belong, which is exactly what they said about Tennessee. They deserve to be here. Great team. But man, when Ohio State plays their game, they're hard to beat. That's also true of Notre Dame, as Indiana found out. And Penn State is now second game in a row where I've come away impressed with Penn State. They actually lost against Oregon, but I came away like, okay, you know what? Those guys battled. And then they went out there and handled their business against SMU, and the moment wasn't too big for them. And that's what frustrates me, right, is that fact that we're taking away from what would be really good storylines because of our narratives. But that's now in the past. Hopefully the conversation's different here now that we're in the quarterfinals. And we
you can hope, but it won't be.
At least in one game, you know, if Arizona State gets killed by Texas, they'll say the same thing about that game. But I think the rest of these, we at least have games, maybe Boise State, Penn State. If Penn State smashes Boise State, you're going to hear this talk about, you know, get rid of automatic bids and all this other kind of nonsense. But
I don't think they should get rid of automatic bids. Maybe they get rid of the way that the buys are put together.
Fair.
I would be okay with that. Look, if you win your conference, you belong in the tournament. Like I'm fine. I am actually fine with that, right? Because it's a smaller version of what the basketball tournament it is, and all those teams that win their conference, they get in. I have no problem with that. You win your conference, you get in. I don't know that I'm all that, and this has nothing to do with the Notre Dame spin of it. Because even if you don't want to give Notre Dame an automatic bye, I'm cool with that. Like I would love to sit at Notre Dame Stadium on December 20th or whatever it is every single year. Every year. And I would be fine with that, right? Because they're never playing a conference championship game. So they'll still get those 3 weeks. Like and
they don't deserve, in my opinion, to get a bye
and that's
without
fine.
Having to play in a conference championship game.
And I'm good with that. So this isn't a Notre Dame argument. This is I don't think that conference champions should automatically get the bye. I think you should look at it and say, okay, who are the teams that actually deserve to get the bye? The best 4 teams should get the bye. That's where I'm at.
Here's where I would just push back on that, Vince, and say, let's find a middle ground on this debate. Because if you just say top 4, then it's basically going to be 3 of the 4, if not all 4 of the byes every year are going to be SEC and Big Ten teams. Every year.
Sure.
Basically, since Notre Dame can't get one, right? So my thing is, okay, give byes to the conference champions as long as they finish in the top 8 to 10. Like you could set some marker. Okay, you can't get an automatic bye if you finish outside the top 10 or let's say the top 8. So this year, you know, maybe Boise still gets a bye, but Arizona State doesn't because they finished outside the top 10. You know, and that's something where I'd say, okay, because otherwise you're just look at the rankings this year. The top 4 teams would have been what? The top 4 seeds would have been Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, Penn State, or Oregon and Penn State would have been the 4 byes, 2 Big Tens, 2 SECs. Since Notre Dame can't get one because Notre Dame would have fallen out. And again, I say Notre Dame doesn't deserve the chance to have a bye. Just like a team that loses their conference championship game doesn't deserve to have a bye because Notre Dame doesn't have to play that extra game. So I'm fine with that. You'll never hear me say, well, Notre Dame's ranked number 3. They should have got a bye. No, they didn't have to go play in an SEC title game like Texas did because Texas would have got a bye if they didn't have to play in the conference. If we're just going off the 4 highest ranked teams, Vince, Texas would have easily been in there as the number 2 seed if they didn't have to play in the conference title game because they were the number two ranked team. And they fell out of that when they got beat by Georgia. Yeah. And then Georgia jumped in. Yeah. So it just like said it like you got to finish in the top 8 or top 10. If you finish outside the top 10, then you don't deserve it. Because otherwise, like I said, Vince, we're going to get that heavy SEC Big Ten bias in the first 4. That's my only issue with it.
That's fair.
And so I'd say that I think that's a fair middle ground. You have to finish at a certain place, top 8, top 10, something like that. It definitely needs to be higher than top 12. Like I don't want a team that finishes 12th getting a bye in the first round of the playoff.
Right.
Over a Texas, over a Penn State.
Yeah.
over a Georgia, let's say, if Texas would have won in overtime against Georgia, I'm sorry, Arizona State still doesn't deserve a bye over Penn State, Ohio State, Notre Dame they do, Georgia, teams like that, right? That's where I would say set some standard for that. Just like I would say the 5th automatic bid can only go to a team that finishes in the top 15. I would set that standard as well. Yes, we're going to take the 5 highest ranked champions unless the 5th highest ranked conference champion ranks outside the top 15 going into conference championship weekend. That's what I would say.
Going into the weekend.
Because otherwise they could just fudge the numbers and
Well, and that's what I worry about in general. If you put a floor on automatic bids and all of that stuff, I could just see the committee jerry rigging that to fit
to a
their
degree, but
narratives.
it would be hard to do because they'd have to do it from the beginning. They'd have to say we're going to rank Boise 11th and never move them.
They did it with Penn State,
and then it'd be obvious, right? It'd be a little bit more obvious that way. So, but Penn State never lost when the rankings came out. That's the thing is we were frustrated by it, but Penn State never lost. There was no there was, hey, now we're arguing subjective things about, well, Notre Dame's resume is now better based on this thing compared to Penn State's based on that thing. But at the end of the day, Penn State still would have been ranked ahead of Notre Dame in the seeding based on our theory because we don't believe that Notre Dame does. Well, what about teams that don't play in the conference championship game? That's a fair debate, but they had the opportunity to do so. But then you can make that rule. No matter where you're ranked, if you don't qualify for your conference championship game, you can't get a bye. Right? So, if the number 1 team is a Big Ten team, the number 3 team is a Big Ten team, and the number 4 team is a Big Ten team or SEC, and based on how things go, the top 4 at the end has got, teams that didn't qualify for the Big Ten or SEC, then they can't get in either. Even if there's a team that it has to be somebody that played in a conference champion. So there's a lot of things you could do if you wanted to be honest with you. But at the end of the day, you're going to have the same arguments next year as you did before. If Bama gets in and they get beat, it's going to be, well, they should have put in South Carolina, or then they should have put in Ole Miss. It's going to be the same type of stuff. That's the reason we went away from voting the polls and went to the BCS, because we were unhappy with the rigged systems that were the polls. Notre Dame should have won it this year. Miami should have won it, whatever. Penn State deserved this year. BCS had the same exact problem. Oklahoma goes out and gets blown out in the Big 12 title game. They're still in the BCS championship game. Miami beats Florida State, but Florida State gets into the same record. There's always flawed systems. There's no perfect system. This one, to me, gives you the best opportunity to do it, because now more teams do get in. That 1989 Notre Dame team would have had a chance to go in there and show that they belong. That 1993 Notre Dame team, that 2002 Miami team would have had a chance. That 2003 USC team that split a championship with LSU, was that 03 or was it 04? But that team, USC team, would have had a chance to go prove it on the field, because they would have got that crack at them. Oklahoma State in 2011 would have had a chance to go out there and show that they were as good as anybody else. Same thing with 11 Stanford. And that's why I think this system is the best, and we're ruining it, and we're ruining a great conversation because we have to spend time talking about this nonsense about, well, this 3-loss team should have been in, and they more deserving whatever because of this. Somebody said this is a great point. I'll wrap it up on this, guys. Why aren't we taking greater talk about strength of schedule? And my response, I saw responses, and I wholeheartedly support this. They did take Alabama's strength of schedule into consideration, which is why they were even considered for being in with 3 losses, and why Syracuse was not, and why Illinois was not, and why other teams why Army with 1 loss was not. They were taken into consideration, and it wasn't enough because you had 2 really, really bad losses. It's as simple as that. I thought that was a great take. That's not my take. That's somebody else had that, and I thought it was a great take, so I'm relaying it because I couldn't agree more. I couldn't put it into better words myself.
All right, boys, let's stop looking back. Let's start looking forward. All right, we got 4 potentially great games, at least the next round of the college football playoff to talk about. So what we're going to do is we are going to jump into them in chronological order. So basically the order that they are going to be played. So there's going to be 1 game on New Year's Eve, and that is the Fiesta Bowl, and it is at 7:30 Eastern on ESPN, obviously from Glendale, Arizona. Penn State is a double-digit favorite. They are favored by 11. This is the first ever matchup between the Nittany Lions and the Broncos of Boise State. So, Brian, I'm going to let you kick this one off. Penn State, give us kind of how they got here. Give us a little bit of a rundown on the Nittany Lions.
I got to say, fellas, to start off with, I have not been a believer in this Penn State team all year. And with one exception, they have done what they needed to do to get here. And you got to give them a lot of credit. Penn State was a preseason number 8 team in the country. I was not as high on this Penn State team for a host of reasons. I thought that they might have a chance. I love their offensive coordinator hire and Andy. I say it 2 weeks in a row. I've got the name right. Andy Kotelnicki. They brought in Tom Allen as a defensive coordinator. I did like those hires, and I wondered how would those hires impact this team's ability to maybe win some of those games that in the past they didn't win. And I think to a degree we saw that, guys. We saw them come out and to start the season off with a really nice, impressive win over West Virginia. Had a sort of a similar to Notre Dame kind of big first game, letdown game in week 2 against a MAC team. The big difference, Notre Dame lost to their MAC team, and Penn State came back from 17-7 and beat the MAC team that they played. And that showed me a little something about this team. And they won a lot of ugly games, but in the past, they lost those ugly games, fellas. In the past, they wouldn't have come back against USC on the road down 20-6 at halftime. They did. They came back, won that game in overtime, showed their grit, struggled early against Wisconsin, and then put Wisconsin away in the second half. Another example, guys, of in the past, Minnesota's another one where they were down for a chunk of the game, came back and won the game. I feel like in the past, at least 1 or 2 of those games would have been losses for Penn State in the past. And I think that's what's different about this Penn State team that got this Penn State team here is, guys, they had those ugly, we didn't show up and play the game we're capable of days that in the past would get them beat. But now they were able to find ways to win, and they won in different ways. Some weeks it was the offense. Some weeks it's the defense. Some weeks it was the special teams. Against Minnesota, the special teams stepped up huge in that game after some mistakes early in the game. And so obviously Penn State went 11-1, earned a bid into the Big Ten championship game, their first appearance since 2016, and were outplayed by Oregon. I think we all watched that game. Oregon was the better team for 4 quarters, but I was very much impressed with Penn State's they never got punked by Oregon. And I kept waiting for that moment to happen. Oregon jumps on them, goes right down the field and scores, and Penn State just marches right back down. Oregon starts to pull some distance between them and Penn State, and then Penn State just comes right back down. They showed a lot of fight, guys, that honestly, before the season, if you'd have brought it up to me, I'd have probably told you I don't think they have that kind of fight in them. When Oregon went up 28-10, I think I might even texted you guys like, well, this is about to get ugly. And Penn State came right back with back-to-back scores. And next thing you know, instead of it being, 42-10 at halftime, which honestly, because when they scored to go up 28-10, guys, there was still 10 minutes left in the second quarter. I'm like, this is going to get ugly. And Penn State scored 2 straight touchdowns, and they weren't fluky. It was an 8-play, 75-yard drive and a 10-play, 64-yard drive. And then that made it 28-24. Oregon scored to make it 31-24. And then from that point on, Penn State you never felt Penn State was going to win, but they kept battling. And that showed me a little something. And then, of course, last week they came out and overwhelmed SMU for much of that game. So I still don't think this is a super sexy Penn State team, but I have grown a lot of respect for this Penn State's team's fight and ability to win games late, with the exception of the Ohio State game, obviously. That was a bit bad loss, but Ohio State's a better team than Penn State. So that's something that I've grown to respect about this Penn State team. I don't know if this is the game where necessarily that any potential issues may get exposed. We're going to find out and have that conversation. But this is a much grittier Penn State team than I thought it was going to be, and that's why they're sitting here in the quarterfinals with a chance to advance to this college football playoff semifinals.
Trevor, give us the rundown on the Broncos from the blue-turfed Boise State.
Yeah, man. Boise State's been one of the more fun teams to watch this season. They went undefeated in their conference, and they avoided a lot of the disaster that other teams at the top of their conference down the home stretch of the season couldn't avoid, right? Like you look at Miami, like I had brought up before, was almost a shoo-in for the ACC Conference Championship game, and a loss late to Georgia Tech kind of sealed the deal for them. Same thing with BYU. Everybody was talking about BYU is going to be ranked here in the playoffs, and they're going to be playing in their conference championship game. And then what did we get? You know what I mean? So Boise State was able to avoid any of those tough losses that would have kept them out of contention for their conference championship. So they did lose their second game of the season, but it was out of conference, and it was against Oregon, the only undefeated team going into the playoffs. They played in Oregon, and they lost 37-34. And that was kind of the game that started turning some heads a little bit for Boise State. They're like, okay, I mean, was this a fluky game for Penn State, or, is this Boise team legit? Oh, and also they have a pretty good dude at running back named Ashton Genty, right? So, I mean, throughout the season, they beat UNLV twice, right? Once in the regular season, 29-24, and then once in the conference championship, 21-7. Key victories for them. They beat Washington State 45-24, and then, like I said, UNLV twice. So Boise State went on a really impressive run, and after losing in week 2, much like Notre Dame, they went on a super long win streak. And it was at the heels of Ashton Genty, who I personally believe should have won the Heisman Trophy. That's a different conversation for a different show. But Ashton Genty's been a dude this season, and anybody who pays attention to college football knows who I'm talking about, right? I mean, he was 3 yards short of 2,500 rushing yards. He had 29 rushing touchdowns and averaged 7.3 yards per carry. So this kid was on an absolute tear. But I will say defensively, it's a little interesting for Boise State. Like I think when you watch them, their defense looks better than what some of the stats may indicate. They rank 33rd in the country in points per game. They've beaten a lot of teams by a big margin. They've dropped 50 a couple times this season. They scored over 40 points a handful of times. They scored over 30 points 8 times. In some of those games, though, they are giving up like 21. Like I think in the game where they scored like 60, they gave up like 34 or something like that. So they rank 33rd in scoring defense. They give up 21.6 points per game. They do rank 61st in total yards allowed in a game. So all these things just kind of fuel into what's going to make this matchup with Penn State more interesting. Their rush defense is better than their pass defense. Their rush defense is ranked number 22nd in the country. Their pass defense is ranked 108th in the country. So from a matchup perspective, it's going to be interesting, but Boise State is one of those teams that 100% belongs where they are because they earned it in the regular season. Teams don't go 12-1 and lose to Oregon by 3 points on the road if it's fluky, right? I mean, they went and they beat UNLV in a rematch, which is a really hard thing to do. And they beat them more convincingly the second time than they did the first time that they played them, in my opinion. So Boise State's been a really fun team to watch this season. There's a lot to talk about with this matchup, but I think it's going to be a lot closer than what the spread's going to indicate.
I want to point something out here real quick. Trev, the point you made is a good one. I want to point something out that Boise State never trailed Oregon by more than 7 points in that game. They had a lead at halftime and they had a lead in the fourth quarter. Whereas Penn State, I don't believe, was ever closer than a touchdown after the first quarter. If I'm correct on that, right? It was first quarter was 14-10 Oregon. They went up 21-10, 28-10. Then it was 11. Then it was 4. So it was 4. In the second half, it was 14-8, 15-8 in the second half of that game. So Boise actually played Oregon more competitively than Penn State did, and Oregon won on a walk-off 0 seconds left in the game field goal. So I thought that was interesting that there is a common opponent between these two. I believe this is the only playoff game, where there is a common opponent between the two. No, Notre Dame and Georgia is the only other one where there's a common opponent, but this is the only one where there's a common opponent that's also in the playoff, which I find to be very interesting. So that it's going to determine the outcome of the game. It's matchups. It's just, It's for people that don't think Boise belongs on this stage. What would they do against other top teams? Well, we've seen them against other top, at least the number one team, and they were as close to beating them as anybody in the country, honestly, because Ohio State didn't lead Oregon late in the game. Boise did. And that's the difference.
Yeah, this game has a lot of very interesting matchups, gentlemen. And, it does look a little David versus Goliath, right? I mean, 11 points is a big number as far as being a favorite, as far as Vegas is concerned and all of that. And At least the first time they've ever played. It's a group of 5 versus a power 5. It's, you know, all of the storylines that you want to write about, you know, big guy, little guy, you know, the whole thing. When you just sit down and talk about football, all right, the biggest matchup disparity for me is probably Boise State's pass defense. I'm nervous about Boise State's pass defense. Every category that there is for pass defense is in the triple digits. And I'm not saying that Penn State is this juggernaut passing team because they want to run the ball first. I mean, they do. Drew Aller is not a pushover. He can throw the ball when he needs to. And that is going to be a very appetizing thing for Penn State's offense, looking across the way and seeing a bunch of triple digit, you know, ranks and against a group of 5 schedule as well. Right. So, to me, that's the big disparity, and I think that is where, like, if Penn State can take advantage of that, then this game may not be all that close.
Couple things on that. If you're Boise State, the 2 teams you want based on your matchups is Penn State or Notre Dame in the second round in the quarterfinals, because those are the 2 teams that are probably the least dynamic throwing teams.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Now, Penn State is a very efficient passing team. And that's what they've done. And again, we know Drew Aller, all the heat he gets for what he is. Reality is Penn State's 8th in college football in passer rating. And Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, Ohio State, Miami, Ole Miss, and Indiana are ahead of them. Right? I mean, that's it. Drew Aller's not a sexy quarterback, as we talk about all the time. He's not a guy that's just going to go out there and just, you know, look like the next, you know, Peyton Manning. He gets the job done, though. Yeah. I mean, this is a kid that this season, you know, had some big struggles against USC early, had a couple bad picks, and then puts that team on his shoulders in the second half and just rips USC apart. You know, he does what he's asked to do. He does his job, and he made some money throws in the Big Ten title game. Yeah, it really comes down to it. But if you're Boise, this is the kind of the matchup you want. And I know that they've given up a lot of yards this year passing, but part of that is because of their schedule and the fact that they've had some blowout wins. So, like, they gave up 372 passing yards to Hawaii. I mean, to Utah State. Well, they won that game 62-30. You know, so they were up big in that game, and you know, they had some big plays. If you watch the game, that's some big plays late. You know, you look at San Jose State threw for 446 yards on them. Well, again, that's because they won 42-21 and they were blowing them out, and that's kind of what San Jose State does. Washington State threw for 327 yards on them because that's what Washington State does. In a game, they won by 3 touchdowns. So these games, they're giving up a lot of yards, are games where, you know, teams are throwing a lot because they're up big. Georgia Southern threw for 322 in a game that Boise won by 11. It wasn't that close. But they threw 50 passes, only 6.4 yards per attempt. Against UNLV, they held UNLV to 110 passing yards and 3.9 yards per attempt in the title game. They held them to 179 yards earlier in the season in the win at UNLV. Like, this is a not a great pass defense, you know, but it's not a terrible pass defense either. I think part of the numbers are a result of the fact that they've just had so big leads and teams are kind of forced to throw the football on them. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to make some plays there, and it's going to really come down to their ability to get pressure on the quarterback. Can they pressure Drew Aller? That's going to be a big question, because this is a team that does get good pressure on the quarterback, guys. This is a team with 51 sacks in the season. They had 4 sacks against Oregon. If they can register 4 sacks in this game, they might have a shot, because I don't care how good I could spin it, guys, about how their pass defense isn't as bad, and that's true, but they still don't have anybody on that defense that matches up against Tyler Warren. So schematically, what are they going to be able to do to keep him out of the game? And then here's the other kind of secret weapon that Penn State has in their pass game. If you do a lot to take out Tyler Warren, next thing you know, they're slipping Nicholas Singleton out of the backfield and getting him in space, and that's what makes them dangerous. So they're a lot like Notre Dame in that they're not going to put up these monster passing numbers, usually Penn State, but they're super efficient. They make the plays that they need to, and they know how to get isolations of their best players. They do I don't know that there's a better OC in the country that has one legitimate passing weapon, but does a better job of finding ways to get him in great matchups, to where, because of how much they move Tyler Warren around, it's almost impossible as a defense to say, hey, we're just going to double team him, because they move him so much. You never know where he's going to be, and he hardly ever ends up where he starts. And I think they do a good job of that. And Boise's going to have a plan for that. If they can force some early incompletions, get them into some 3rd and longs, that's where you slow them down. And actually, SMU did a pretty decent job of that early against Penn State. I mean, their 14-0 lead was because of they had 2 pick sixes. Like SMU was moving the ball a little bit on them, and Penn State didn't do a whole lot on offense early in that game. If Boise can avoid those big mistakes, then I think they have a shot to at least keep this game close. But then on the other side, Trev, the key for Boise is, guys, you're just not going to run Ashton Genty down their throat for 4 quarters. You're going to have to step up, and somebody else is going to have to make plays. And it comes down to it. I just don't know that Maddox Madsen is the quarterback in a game like this to make the plays necessary to keep Penn State honest and keep them from just saying, hey, everybody stop Genty. That's the key. Stop him, and they're done. And that's basically the game plan. No one's been able to do it yet, but they haven't played a run defense like Penn State yet either. And that's going to be the key. Maddox Madsen is going to absolutely be 100% the key to this game, fellas. If he can make some plays early with his arm and his legs, which he did against UNLV in the title game, that's what gives them a chance to stay in this football game. Because I do believe, Trev, I'm not sure if you agree with this, if it's a 4-quarter game, I think Boise has a shot. The thing I'd be worried about as a Boise fan is Penn State jumping on you early, and now you got to play catch up. That would be my big concern in this game.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Boise State, weather the storm early. I mean, Penn State's going to come out fired up. Not that Boise State won't, but Penn State is used to playing this level of opponent, right? Like Penn State this season has played Ohio State. They played Illinois earlier in the season when they were ranked. They played Oregon this year in the Big Ten title game. They just did what they did to SMU. And Boise State hasn't played a football game since they beat UNLV, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how that comes out. If UNLV can weather the storm early and keep it to where they don't have to totally abandon the run game, because I agree with you. I don't know if Maddox is the type of player that can put the team on his back and consistently make plays for 4 quarters to keep them within striking distance. You look at his performances against UNLV, right? He did enough. Like in key moments, he made some big throws. UNLV's defense is put together a little bit differently than Penn State's defense, right? They don't have Abdul Carter coming off of the end at you out there in Las Vegas. So that's going to be interesting. For me, the key is, and you see it all the time, is when inexperienced offensive coordinators in big games like this. Now, luckily for them, their offensive coordinator is one of their former head coaches, like the head coach that kind of put Boise State on the map. So he has experience in big games, but there is a tendency sometimes to go away from the run the second that you get down, remotely anywhere close to like a big deficit. So don't completely take Ashton Genty out of the game because he is your best offensive weapon. I think they're going to have to get creative with how they use him because it's no secret what they're going to do. You know what I mean? They're lining up and running this kid 30 times a game, minimum.
And I feel like, Vince, that the game plan for Boise up front is similar to the one that Notre Dame has. You don't have to dominate Penn State's front. You don't. Genty's the kind of back, and honestly, the 2 best backs I've seen at this all season, actually the 3, 2 of them are at Notre Dame and 1 of them at Boise, where it doesn't require dominant blocking. Like you don't need 2012 Stanford O-line for Genty to go off. He's not going off because their offensive line is phenomenal. It's a good offensive line. You don't put up the numbers he's had in spite of the offensive line, right? But this isn't like 2017 Notre Dame offensive line. It's just get a body on a body. And can they do that enough to let him rip off a couple big runs early? Because that's the other thing, too, is we talk about the pass game's got to take some pressure off. But if he is able to get a couple gash runs early, some way, somehow, with some different things, like if I'm Boise, I'm coming out early. I'm shifting over double tights, motioning across. I'm doing things to kind of get Penn State moving, just saying, hey, we just got to catch one. We got to catch him on one, and then that kind of loosens things up. Sure. That's going to be an interesting matchup, too, because this is a pretty good Penn State defensive line. But there have been a couple games this season, like Minnesota early in that game was kind of gashing them a little bit. And Minnesota does not run the ball well. There have been some games, like I thought the Penn State defense did a pretty good job early against Ohio State's run game, but then just could not get off the field when everybody in the stadium knew what was coming late in the game. This hasn't always been the best rush defense in the country. I mean, their numbers are good, guys, But there have definitely been some moments this year where Penn State's rush defense looked a little vulnerable. Ohio State late, USC early, Minnesota early, Oregon pretty much the whole game. Like, there's some games they look great, some games that they look vulnerable. And I'm very curious if Boise can take advantage of that and hit some gash plays. That's what Boise needs to do. Now, for Penn State, it's if you dominate first and second down, this game won't be close. It won't. Because if they get into third and longs, Boise's toast.
Agreed.
They're toast.
Yeah.
They're going to have to be great on first and second down to have a shot in this football game. And that's what Boise's been good at all year, Trev. I mean, the games like against UNLV, they weren't Boise lighting the world on fire with 40 points a game. They scored in the 20s, I think, both games. But they grinded UNLV down. They were good on first and second down. You know, Genty wasn't ripping them up the first game, but he was getting 4, he was getting 6, he was getting 5. And that allowed them to keep moving the chains. And then eventually he breaks one. Like second game, too, it's 14-0 with like 30 seconds left in the half. Genty had, he was pounding him. He wasn't ripping him up. He didn't have any. And then all of a sudden, boom, 70. Touchdown. 21-0 ball game. Like that's the thing is as we said, guys, if Boise can just keep it close early, eventually Genty's going to break one. You hope that happens when it's 17-10 or 17-7. And not 27-7 or 27-3.
Yeah.
That's what you have to hope for. So the defense is going to have to make some big stops. I do think this is a scrappy Boise State defense. They just have to limit the big plays in the passing game, as we talked about early. It's going to be a fun matchup.
Yep.
It is.
I agree. No, I was just going to say, I agree. They're going to have to limit, Penn State's explosive plays. That's going to be the key for Penn State. I mean, if Penn State just comes out, they're going to want to run the ball. They're going to want to play action. They're an old school offense. There's no doubt about that. That's what they're going to want to do. Again, the Boise State pass defense worries me a little bit. If you're a Boise State fan, right? I think that's an area that they could take advantage of. But again, that's not the bread and butter for Penn State. So just because it's a place where they could take advantage doesn't mean they will. And so I think that's going to be a big part of this as well. If you're Boise, you need to limit the big plays. You need to keep the score tight. If you can keep the score tight going into the end of the game, into the fourth quarter, if it's a one-score game going into the fourth quarter, it's going to be a heck of a finish. That's the way I see it. If Penn State gets out early, that's not what you want as a Boise State fan, because I just don't think that they're built for comebacks. They're just not built to throw the ball around, score fast. Like, I mean, they can score fast, but that's only if Ashton Genty busts off an 80-yard run. Right. I mean, they can do it, but that's just not. You can't go into a game plan. Okay, we're gonna have 3 80-yard runs here. Like that's not a game plan.
Can't bank on it.
Correct.
You can do it, but that's not how you game plan.
It's funny you say that, Vince, because that's why Notre Dame and Boise State are here.
Right, that's true.
It's because of that. But again, Mike Denbrock doesn't go into game saying, okay, if we get back to put our own 2, we're going to run outside zone and it's going to go for 98.
Right.
We got them right where we want them.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like to your point, that's not it. The thing that's concerning for Boise too is Penn State's biggest vulnerability, and we talked about this when we previewed the Big Ten title game. If you've got athletes on the perimeter, you can give them a lot of problems. A lot of problems. This is not your typical Penn State secondary. Problem is Boise just doesn't have that type of athlete. Really, Cameron Camper's a good football player, man. He is a good football player, but is he a guy that's going to put the fear of God into the Penn State secondary? No, he's not. You talk about what Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart and those kind of guys. He just doesn't. But if Boise is able to stay in this game or pull off the upset, because I think all 4 underdogs are capable of pulling off upsets, even the 2 big double-digit dogs. I do think they're capable of it. Now, they need a lot of things to go right to win this game, but for Boise, what's got to go right is you've got to force some turnovers from the Penn State offense, and Penn State this year, guys, has not been a team that turns the ball over a whole lot, right? And Boise State's not a team that forces the ball to be turned over a whole lot. But there have been times when Penn State has been careless with the football. You think to the Oregon game, you think to the USC game, but they just don't beat themselves a lot. And that's the thing that could help Boise. I just don't know if they can do that. But then the other one is you've got to hit some big plays early in the pass game, as we talked about. Some well-designed first down, move the chains, but also some shots. If they can somehow get the ball over top a couple times early on Penn State, maybe that's enough to loosen them up to allow Genty to then rip off some big runs. I think those are going to be some keys to Penn State. And if for Boise, if you're Penn State, it's quite the opposite. Shut them down on early downs, put them in situations where they have to throw the football. And on the other side of the ball, you got to protect the football. Don't put your defense in any bad spots against Boise State, right? You can't do that. And then Drew Allard, dude, just be what you've been all year. You don't got to be Superman in this game. Just be what you've been all year. Get the ball where it's supposed to go to, hit a couple third downs, scramble a couple times, which he's actually pretty good at. If you lose contain on your pass rush lanes, he'll step in and move the chains with his legs. Just be what you've been all year. Don't try to go out there and win this football game with some big-time throws into tight coverage. Don't do that. Just do what you've been doing all year. Manage the offense. Don't put your defense in a bad spot. And when those opportunities come, let Nick Singleton and Keytron Allen and Tyler Warren do their thing. And he's been great at that all year. They're going to need him to be that again against Boise.
All right, Brian. Prediction time for this game. We'll go you, we'll go Trev, then we'll go me. All right, so give us your prediction for this game.
I'm going Penn State 27, Boise State 17. I think it's going to be a closer game than that. But I think it's a game where Penn State is always in control, and it's, they're up by 10 to 14, then Boise scores to make it, and then Penn State kicks a field goal up by 7. Boise kicks a field goal to make it 4 again. Then Penn State scores again. I think it's one of those games where it's 24-17 and Penn State kicks a field goal to ice it at the end, or it's 20-17. Boise had just scored to make it 20-17, and Penn State goes right back down and puts the game away. That type of game, 27-17. I could see Penn State blowing Boise out. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think Boise is a good football team. I just don't think they have enough firepower against an opponent like this in the pass game to protect Ashton Genty enough. But I do think he'll get his early, and it's just going to not be quite enough. They're going to need more of a team effort than him to be Hercules today. They're going to need more against Penn State, and I don't think they're going to have quite enough. So I'm going Penn State 27, Boise 17.
All right, Trev, what do you got?
I have Penn State winning as well, but I have it being close and the game plan out a little different. I have Penn State winning 21-17. So in Penn State's best games where they've started out, right? Like in their big moments, they've relied on the defense to step up in big ways, right? They have, that pick 6 early against Will Howard against Ohio State. And then against SMU, Kevin Jennings was just going nuts, not in a good way. But Penn State's offense wasn't able to do anything off of that. Their defense was starting to carry him a little bit. And Maddox Madison, I don't know if he is, as much of a game wrecker as what Boise State might need him to be in this game. But if there is one thing I do know about him is he takes care of the football. And I don't know if this is going to be a moment where Penn State can kind of get their night started with a big turnover. They weren't able to against Oregon, and they were never really able to pull in that close. I could see this being a game where, Boise State might take an early lead. And when I mean an early lead, I mean like a 3-0, maybe a 7-0, punch it in late. But I think that Penn State overall is going to be able to take the lead going into halftime, and Boise State's never going to be able to catch back up because, I think Boise's going to take a lead early and they might try to nurse it because I just don't think that they have I don't think they have the horses to try to play in a shootout type of game. And what Penn State showed us against Oregon is they're able to do that to a degree. We were talking about the Penn State-Oregon game, and we were like, hey, if this turns into a shootout, this might get real ugly. Didn't have it on my bingo card that Penn State was going to drop 37, right? So I do have it being closer. I think Boise State covers the spread because I think part of what Vegas is doing is kind of covering their tracks for what happened in the first round, if I'm just being 100% honest with you, because it's no mystery that, Boise State and Arizona State are double-digit dogs while, Oregon and like Notre Dame are within like a field goal. You know what I mean? So I'm going to still take Penn State in this one just because I think they have the better horses, the bigger horses, the more experience. But Boise State's going to make this competitive.
What say you, Vince?
Well, I tell you what, listening to you guys, it's always nice to listen to you guys break a game down and go after it. And you guys have brought up some very interesting points and ones that I don't disagree with.
Vince?
You're welcome. And just putting a little shine on the boss. It never hurts anything. No, just kidding. No, listen, this game, I think it is. I still have no faith in Penn State's head coach. He's had 2 good games in a row. I feel like it's like it's like, throwing the ball in the roulette wheel. Like eventually this is coming to an end. Like that's how I feel about this whole thing. But I just don't think it's going to come to an end in this game.
These type of games he's won, beating Memphis in the Cotton Bowl.
That's exactly right. Like he can't screw this up. Like I don't see him messing this game up. I just don't. Now if he does,
Penn State fans are super pissed right now because he's like, "You jinxed us. You jinxed us."
Now here's the other thing, right? If he does screw it up, this is not going to be the surprise look. You know what I'm saying? But I don't feel like he will. He's got more talent. They should win this game. They should win this game. I do think they jump out to a bit of an early lead, and I think they have control of this game pretty much, for the duration. Boise State will look good here and there. I think Genty's still going to get his, as they say, as the kids like to say. I think he'll bust out a long run. But I just don't see Boise State scoring more than 2 touchdowns in this game. So I have 27-14. So I'm kind of in the same neighborhood as you, Brian. You've got Boise scoring a field goal in there. So I've got Penn State winning 27-14, and they're in control throughout. That's how I see it playing out. So 27-14 is mine. So we all have Penn State, but a little bit of a variation on how they get there. Let's turn the calendar to 2025 and talk about the next game that is in line here, and that is the Peach Bowl. In Atlanta, Georgia, in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, one that is very familiar to Irish fans. It is number 5, Texas, against number 4, Arizona State. That game, again, takes place on January 1st at 1 o'clock on ESPN. Texas, this is the biggest line of this round. Texas is favored by 13.5 points. Texas won the only previous meeting, which was the 2007 Holiday Bowl, and they won pretty big, 52-34.
What?
So
a Holiday Bowl was high scoring? No way.
I know. Hey,
no way.
Shock and awe. All right, Brian, I'm going to have you kick this one off. Talk about the Sun Devils of Arizona State, kind of how they got here, and make sure you throw in as much scatterboo as you possibly can.
Yes, well, the Fighting Scataboos got here, Vince. This is one of the better stories of the season. I mean, it really is. This is a team that literally, according to the Big 12 media, was picked to finish dead last in the Big 12. And at 141 points, they were 16 points behind Houston, who was 15, and then 55 points behind Cincinnati. Now, with all due respect, the Big 12 media had a rough year, and it's not necessarily their fault. They had Utah, K-State, and Oklahoma State, Kansas, and Arizona as their top 5. Their bottom 5 included Baylor, who I think won 7-8 games. BYU is pretty good. Cincinnati, Houston, and, of course, Arizona State, who won the league. But honestly, guys, they didn't necessarily – they got it wrong, but it was understandable. We all got it wrong. I thought Arizona State was going to stink this year. This is a football team that's coming off of a 3-9 season, where they had losses by 12, 29 to Fresno, 14, 3 to Cal, 3 at home to Colorado, who was terrible. They lost by 8 to Washington. Go figure that one. Lost by 52 to Utah, lost by 36 to Oregon, and lost by 36 to Arizona at the end of the season. And, yeah, they got the transfer quarterback from Michigan State, Sam Leavitt, who's a talented young player. They got Jordan Tyson through the portal, obviously Cam Scatterboo. But, guys, this was a team that just is not supposed to be a very good football team. I mean, that's Cam Scatterboo last year as well. And Kenny Dillingham did a masterful job with his football team. He really did. And you kind of saw a little bit of it early where you thought, you know what, they're not going to be half bad. You go out and you beat Mississippi State at home. Yeah, Mississippi State's not very good, but it's an SEC team that had beaten Arizona a couple previous years before. They play what I think is a decent Texas State team led by G.J. Kenny. Go on the road, beat them. Actually watch that game. It was a very entertaining game. They won late. Lost to Texas Tech. You're like, you know what? But, hey, you're 3-1. And then you start to kind of get some wins over some bigger name teams. They beat Kansas at home. They beat Utah at home. And then they go have that loss to Cincinnati. And you're thinking, 5-2, they're going to make a bowl game. This is a heck of a coaching job by Kenny Dillingham. They haven't lost since. That was October 19th. They haven't lost since. They blew out Oklahoma State. They had a bye week after the Cincinnati loss, which was a bad loss, by the way. Blew out Oklahoma State. Beat UCF without Cam Scatterboo, by the way. Then go on the road to beat K-State, who I think is a good football team, by 10. Beat BYU by 5 in a game that wasn't as close as the final score showed. BYU scored late to make it that close. and then blow out Arizona State on the road, and then go into the Big 12 title game, fellas, and beat Iowa State 45-19 in the game that was not nearly as close as the final score showed. They could have scored over 60 in that game if they wanted to. That was an absolutely brilliant performance, and I got to give Kenny Dillingham a lot of credit. Those kids play loose all season long. They played with no pressure. And then as what I loved about it, guys, is we've seen teams do this before where they play with no pressure because there is none, and then all of a sudden late in the year, like, wow, we're better than we thought. We have a shot at this, and they kind of fold. In some games, we saw K-State do that. We saw Iowa State do that a little bit, where Iowa State played really tight in that game. And Arizona State came out and said, no one expected us to be here anyway, so we're just going to go out there and have some fun, and lit Iowa State up and earned us a right to be here, fellas. I mean, it was a great season. I understand Kurt Cignetti is considered the favorite to win the Coach of the Year and all that, and it's deserved. But if you're not going to give it to Kurt Cignetti, it's got to go to Kenny Dillingham. The job he did with this football team, and a lot of it was, I mean, you got some portal guys, but there's a lot of guys that were already on the team that just bought into what he's selling and turned this thing around. He did a brilliant job with this football team, and it's a more talented team than you'd think. The big problem is late in the season, they lost their stud receiver, Jordan Tyson, to an injury. He will not play in this game, but they were able to go out and win some other games without him, but those teams weren't Texas. But just a great run to get here, fellas. They 11-2 season after going 3-9 last year. And a lot of blowouts. Phenomenal coaching job. There have been several great coaching jobs this season. Deion Sanders did one at Colorado to lead them to a 9-3 record. We've talked a lot about, a lot of these coaches have done a great job, but Kenny Dillingham's job that he did this year at Arizona State's as good as the job anybody's done.
Like, this is the same team that was holding open kicker tryouts like early on in the season. I mean, just to throw the special teams angle in there, like
necessary roughness angle, right? Like, right. I mean, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, does Kathy Ireland come to try out for the team or something like, you know what I mean? Like
successful teams don't have open tryouts in the middle of the season, like generally. That's just not, those two things don't usually go hand in hand. And when you're putting out an announcement to the student body that there's open kicking tryouts, like usually things aren't going in the right direction. And now they're in the college football playoff, which is just mind-blowing. Like the whole story of Arizona State is just absolutely mind-blowing. So completely agree with everything that you're saying there, Brian. So that leaves Texas for Trevor. Trevor, give us the rundown on Texas's season and how they got to the Peach Bowl.
Texas has had an interesting season. They finished in second place in the SEC. They lost to Georgia in a rematch from the regular season. They lost 22-19 in overtime when Georgia had Gunnar Stockton and Carson Beck was knocked out on the final play of the first half on a Hail Mary attempt. They went 7-1 in conference during the regular season. Their only loss was to Georgia in the regular season at home, 30-15. Here's why I say that Texas's schedule is weird, because we're all under the consensus here that like ranked wins are considered like who finishes the season ranked, right? Like And so for Texas, it's weird, right? Technically, they have one ranked win on the season, and it's beating Clemson in the first round of the playoffs. But they also beat Michigan, who was ranked when they played them. Vanderbilt was ranked when they played them. Oklahoma was ranked when they played them, and Texas A&M was ranked when they played them. However, they're not ranked anymore. We know how Michigan's season turned out. We know how Vandy finished. We know how Oklahoma finished, right? Go midshipmen. But it's interesting to see that Texas was decimating some of these teams. They went into the big house and handled Michigan. You know what I mean? And everybody's like, yo, this team is pretty legit. But I would make the argument that Texas is one of those teams in the playoffs that we still don't know quite yet what this team is about. You know what I mean? Because we don't have that.
Do you mean like we don't know quite how good they are?
Yes.
Fair.
Yeah,
Fair.
because we've seen them play well, but it's been against like inferior opponents that you kind of have to make an argument for. They beat Florida, they beat Arkansas at Arkansas, and Kentucky all by double digits. And those three teams gave other teams in the SEC a lot of problems. You know what I mean? But you don't really know how good Texas is, because once they've gotten on that big stage, they lost to the best team that they played this season twice. Once was a very not convincing, or a very convincing loss to Georgia in the regular season. And the second time was in the SEC championship game when you let the backup come in and lead a basically game-winning drive in overtime. And the rushing offense for Georgia took over. So Texas is one of the few teams in the playoffs that people kind of have some question marks about. Like how good is Texas? And a lot of those questions are going to be answered against Arizona State because this is a very quality opponent. Despite whatever narratives people want to draw up, Texas has had issues at times this season stopping the run. And what does Arizona State do really, really well? They run the football well. So this is going to be a much more interesting matchup than I think what the spread indicates. But it's going to be interesting. Will they be able to establish the line of scrimmage? For Texas, you go back and look, and in the games that they performed the best, they were able to run the ball well. They had convincing wins over Kentucky, and they beat Texas A&M that in a game that was closer than 17-7, and they beat Clemson 38-24 in a game that was not really ever that close. The commonality in those three, they all rushed the ball for over 200 yards. When Texas is able to put Quinn Ewers in a spot where he doesn't have to go be Superman, they do really well. And what happened those two games against Georgia? They combined for 60 rushing yards. So line of scrimmage is going to be a big topic of discussion, but this is how Texas got here. They're a team with a lot of question marks, but they're also a team with a lot of talent, a lot of size, a lot of skill, and they're now starting to become healthy at the right time. So it's going to be a fun matchup when they take on Arizona State.
So another potential, at least it's 2 Power 5 teams, but another potential, blue blood versus a newbie. Big spread in this one, obviously 13.5. It's big, even a bigger spread than Penn State and Boise State. So boys, how do you see this one going? What are the matchups that stand out to you? What should we be looking for when we flip on the old TV at 1:00 on New Year's Day?
Well, let me ask you, Trev, this question. How much, and it may not be at all, how much does this matchup change if Jordan Tyson's playing in his football game for you?
For me, not a lot, because I'm coming at it from the physicality standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Tyson absolutely adds a different dynamic to Arizona State's passing offense, but I think Texas has one of the best passing defenses in the country. I think it would have made a factor, but to me, this game comes down to who's the more, can Arizona State hang out?
And that's why I do think Jordan Tyson would have mattered because of exactly what you said. And that's what makes me feel like maybe they're not going to be able to stay in this game for 4 quarters.
Sure. Because
I think Arizona State's going to come out and be very physical on Texas. And if they come out early in the game and run the ball on them, sort of like what Indiana did to Ohio State on that opener, but eventually you're going to have to do something other than just run it for 4. It's like what we talked about in the last game, right? Like you're not going to be able to run Cam Scatterbo for 4 quarters. Now, Arizona State still has better weapons around Cam Scatterbo than Ashton Genty has around him, even without Jordan Tyson, and a better quarterback in Sam Leavitt than what he has with Maddox Madsen. But I feel like against this Texas secondary, you need something to kind of take the pressure off. And that's the big thing for me, guys, is who steps up at receiver with Jordan Tyson out. If nobody does, then it's going to be hard for me to see Arizona State scoring enough to win, because I could see Arizona State moving the ball but then getting field goals instead of touchdowns, because as the field gets closer, they can put more and more resources into the box to stop Cam Scatterbo. The other thing, too, is what we've seen from Arizona State is in some of those games where they really start getting rolling, a lot of times they'll be able to hit some big passing plays. We saw that against Arizona State, where they hit some big throws early. They're going to have to be able to hit those in these games, guys, early. Similarly, against this great pass defense, that's what Clemson did. What Clemson did early in that game is they came out and they hit some – Kate Klubnik threw some dimes in that football game, and his receivers and his tight end played great football. They're going to need to be able to make some of those plays to take some of the pressure off of Cam Scatterbo, because the one thing that can overcome physicality at this level is numbers, right? Like numbers in the box. And if they can do something to get Texas to play them more straight up, I do think they can run the football on them. There's no doubt. And then on the other side, Trev, is can Texas protect Quinn Ewers? He has not looked right for a while, guys. He really hasn't. He has not looked right for a while. And he just doesn't. The issue is, Trev, Arizona State has 21 sacks on the season. They're not a team that puts a lot of pressure on the quarterback. And I think ultimately that's my biggest concern in this game is I don't know that Arizona State on defense has enough to slow down Texas. Because what we've seen from Texas, to your point, Trev, you nailed it. Why did they look so bad against Georgia and even Arkansas? but didn't look bad in other games because those are the only teams that are able to whoop them in the trenches with their defense. And Georgia's a bad matchup for Texas. Clemson, it turned into a track meet and had no chance. Michigan, it turned into a track meet, no chance. Florida, track meet, no chance. If you get into a track meet with Texas, you're toast. If you make it a who's bigger, who's more physical, who's stronger, which is exactly what Trev said, that's where you have a chance to beat Texas. And I think Arizona State can do that early, guys. The question is, can they do enough on the perimeter on offense to stay with Texas early to allow them to wear Texas down late? That's my concern. And is their defense, do they have enough athleticism on the back end to come into this game against Texas and stop the receivers, Matthew Golden, Ryan Wingo, the Gunnar Helmet tight end, to the outside zone stretch stuff, perimeter stuff, the misdirection they do? Do they have enough weapons to stop that? Clemson didn't on defense. So even though Clemson's offense played pretty well early, their defense just couldn't stop Texas. Arizona State's going to have to get some early stops, and I think Texas has got too many weapons against a team that, if we're being honest, guys, has not exactly been a light the world on fire defense this season. Boise State's got a much better defense, in my opinion, than Arizona State does. And I know they've played better late, but I just don't know if it's enough against a team that's got these kind of weapons.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I think Texas's arsenal of skilled players is just going to be too much for them. When they're humming, Jadon Blue and Quintravion Wisner are a tough duo to stop. Clemson found that out the hard way. Kentucky found that out the hard way. Texas A&M did. I mean, to put some numbers behind it, against Clemson, Jadon Blue went for $146 and 2 touchdowns. Wisner went for 110 and 2 touchdowns. Against Kentucky, Quintravion Wisner went for $158 and a touchdown, and Jadon Blue went for 96. And then against the Aggies, Wisner went for 186 and averaged 5.6 yards per carry. So it's going to be tough. And now their offensive line is back being healthy. But on defense, if Arizona State on offense can be physical enough to hang in and give themselves an opportunity at the end, I like them because they're a scrappy team, right? Like, these are the teams that you kind of have to be aware for in the play. A team that has nothing to lose. I mean, legitimately nothing to lose. I mean, they were voted the team predicted to finish last in their conference. Nobody expected them to be in their conference championship in the first place, let alone win. And now here they are receiving a first-round bye in the first.
And they needed a lot of help in November, Trev, to even get into the Big 12 title game. You know what I mean? Like, they needed a lot of other people. And as those teams kept falling, and they just kept winning.
Yeah.
And to your point, man, it's like the Indiana Notre Dame game last week. All the pressure's on Notre Dame. There's no pressure on Indiana. Same thing this week. All the pressure's on Texas. There's none on Arizona State. Can Arizona State handle the moment better than Indiana did? Now, what Arizona State has going for them is they don't have to play this game in Texas's home stadium, right? I mean, that's a little different environment. But that's the question, is can they handle the moment? They've handled it so far, guys, but the Big 12 championship game is a whole lot different than playing in a college football playoff game against Texas. And playing against Iowa State, and Matt Campbell did another coach who did a phenomenal coaching job this season is Matt Campbell. But that's a different animal than But like to our point though, what the concern we had about that game, guys, is because we thought, I think I said I had Arizona State winning, but I said if the pass defense can't slow down Iowa State's quarterback and their 2,000-yard receivers, then I can see Iowa State running away with it. Well, they made Rocco Beck look bad in that game. I mean, they shut that pass game down. So as much as I dislike their pass defense on the whole of the season, the last time they played against a team that had 3,000-yard or 2,000-yard receivers and a 1,000-yard running back, or a 3,000-yard quarterback, they shut that pass game down. Mm-hmm. And we're able to confuse him with a lot of different coverage structures and rolling coverages, showing this, disguising this. And Rocco Beck looked uncomfortable the entire game. Can they do that to Quinn Ewers, who hasn't shown himself to be the most, I hate to say not mentally tough, but just just not confident, right? Yeah. Just not super confident, not super poised. Trev, you and I were talking about this the other day. I think it was you. I texted. I said, "Have you seen?" It might have been somebody else, but I said, "Have you seen Georgia run corner fires against anybody other than Texas?" And it hasn't been many, but they've brought multiple corner fires against Texas. Why? Quinn Ewers doesn't see it. He does not see that high and wide pressure off the backside. Can Arizona State find a way to get one of those pressures home and force an early turnover? I think ultimately that's something that they need if they're going to win this football game. If Texas protects the football and Quinn Ewers just plays a solid football game, Texas will win. The only question will be by how much. But if they can force turnovers and beat them up front, that's where Arizona State has a chance to pull this one off.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that Quinn Ewers has not been playing as confidently in the pocket in comparison to what he did against like Michigan or what he did against Oklahoma. Right. And I think some of that is the injuries up front. You combine that with him playing on a bad ankle, his confidence is not where it was in comparison to earlier in the season. So if Arizona State is able to generate any sort of pressure on him, I think that's going to make this game that much more interesting.
All right, boys, it's prediction time. So let's jump right into this thing. We'll go the same order that we did last time. Brian, your prediction for this game.
I have Texas 31, Arizona State 20. I do think it's a game that if Texas comes out fast, this game could be over quick. Because I don't know that Arizona State can throw the ball the way that Clemson did against Texas. I think that game for Texas's pass defense was a lot like the USC game was for Notre Dame's pass defense. The other team's quarterback just played out of his mind. Receivers made some big-time plays, and they just didn't play great football. And I think that's going to be a big difference here. I think that's going to allow Texas to get their safeties more involved. I think Andrew Makuba is going to have a ton of tackles. Now, he's going to have a headache after the game trying to hit Cam Scadaboo 15 times, in this game. But I just think Texas has too much speed. They have too much depth. This is a good Texas defense. I do think that if Arizona State can, like you guys talked about, Trev, I think you said this, or maybe it's Vince, in the earlier one, if you can weather that early storm, you can stay in this football game. I think that's what they got to do to not get blown out. I think the only way Arizona State can win this game, in my opinion, is just multiple turnovers from Texas. That's the way I see it. So I'm going 31-20 in a game that really we're going to look back and say, yes, it was 11 points, but Texas was clearly the better team. And I could see this being the one game that gets really ugly. I don't think Boise State's going to get completely rolled by Penn State the way that maybe some people think that it is. I could see Arizona State getting rolled by Texas unless they can force a lot of turnovers. And like Trevor said at the very beginning, if they can control the line of scrimmage, that's the chance they have. Because I think controlling the line of scrimmage, Trev, is going to result in the turnovers that we talk about. That's going to be the key. I just don't think they can do it for 4 quarters, guys, especially with the speed advantage that I think Texas has on the perimeter. So I'm 31-20 Longhorns.
Trev.
I have.
Oh, don't do that. Don't do that, Brian. Don't.
Ooh. I have
in there. Okay.
Ooh. I have Texas winning 34-24. And I do think it's going to be close early. I think Steve Sarkisian is going to be a little bit too much in his own head about, all right, like we did what we needed to against Clemson. We ran the ball well. We're going to rely on our athletes on the perimeter. Right, they're going to rely on the Isaiah Bonds of the world. They're going to get Jadon Blue involved in the passing game. And so I think early on, it's going to look a little bit sloppy from Texas. There's going to be a lot, hey, we got some offensive linemen back. We're going to be able to protect Quinn Ewers again. This is going to be a chance to maybe get him into a rhythm before they have to move on and play either Ohio State or Oregon. I think Arizona State's going to be able to capitalize on that a little bit and move the line of scrimmage in their favor on offense. But I think I fall in line with Brian. I think Texas has too many horses and they're a little bit too deep. I do. Because their skill set that they have with their running backs, with the size, the defense that they have is not like anything that Arizona State has seen this season. I think it's going to be a good fight and one that we'll look back on. I think it's going to be a tale of two halves. I do. I think Arizona State is going to look really competitive. I think it could be like a little back and forth first half. A little bit, Arizona State scores, Texas scores, Arizona State gets a field goal, Texas scores, something like that. Then I think in the second half, Texas kind of puts a lot of that to rest. They go back to what runs their offense the most efficiently, and they pull away late, win 34-24.
All right, boys. So you both have Texas winning the game. A little bit of a different way of going about it. I am heavy on Texas in this game. My final score is 34-10. There's a lot of pluckiness about Arizona State. I love the story. I love everything about it. I don't think they can hold a candle to what Texas is going to do. I don't think Texas is going to stumble out of the gate. I think they're going to come out and pound it. And Quinn Ewers is going to do whatever he needs to do, but he's not going to be the X factor in this game. I think they're going to run it down Arizona State's throat, and I don't know if Arizona State's going to know what hit them. That's kind of where I'm at with this whole thing.
So are you kind of seeing this, Vince, as like what we see in the NCAA basketball tournament from time to time? Cinderella goes on a run, but when it ends, it ends
hard. Like
yeah.
it ends off a cliff. Like that's where I see this one
they
going.
Finally run into that one really good team, and they run them off the court. Yeah.
And look, Texas has holes. Don't get me wrong.
Every team in the tournament this year has holes. 100%.
They are not a perfect team, but I think they match up well against Arizona State. That's where I'm at with this whole thing. I just think the matchups are not in Arizona State's favor. And as much as I like Kenny Dillingham and I like the story and all of that stuff, I just think Texas is gonna be too much to handle for them. I just do, and I think it's gonna be over pretty quickly.
The other thing too, Vince, is I think there's some misconceptions about Texas's run defense because of what Georgia did to them in the second half of the game last week. That wasn't typical of what Texas has done on the ground.
Yeah.
They've had a couple games here and there, but for the most part, they've been a pretty good rushing defense.
Right.
Especially if the other team can't throw. And that's what killed Michigan. They couldn't throw on them. Now, Sam Levitt's a way better quarterback than Davis Warren.
Sure.
Right? But not to the degree where I think they pull off this upset. So
yeah.
I hope it's more competitive than that, Vince, but I won't be shocked. I don't Trevor,
I want it to be more
that Vince's score is what it turns out to be. I won't be shocked. I think Arizona State's going to put up a little bit more of a fight, Vince, but I wouldn't be surprised.
No, I wouldn't at all.
Before we move on, would this be the biggest upset of the weekend? If all four teams that are favored to lose, like obviously Ohio State and I mean Oregon and Notre Dame wouldn't be giant upsets. They're 2-point underdogs. But of the two, would Arizona State beating Texas be a bigger upset than if Boise beat Penn State?
100%.
What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Not even close. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would. I mean,
is that because of your thoughts on Boise, or more because you think Texas is that much better than Penn State, or both?
All of the above.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of the narrative base too. I mean, what would be taken away from the game? You know, you have a team in Arizona State that plays in the Big 12. Nobody thought anything of them and beat what was for a good amount of the season resume, like schedule wise, one of the better teams in the SEC. I mean, they were the highest ranked SEC team going into conference championship weekend, you know, and then you have a team like Penn State that has a lot of question marks around them. I also think Texas has a lot. They just aren't as highlighted, I think, partly due to what conference that they play in and the name that they have. And then what Penn State's reputation has been over the last couple of years is, I mean, they'll go 10-2. They'll lose to the two best teams that they play. So, I would say that this would be the biggest upset of the weekend. You can make the argument it would have been the biggest upset of the playoffs, if I'm being honest, up to this point.
Yep.
Because I don't you look at round one. I was high on SMU the same way that you guys were, and they would have beat a team in Penn State that again does not have a great track record in the big games. I don't think IU beating Notre Dame would have been this colossal upset, not in comparison to what this game would have been. Then Tennessee, Ohio State, that game, I think the line was relatively close when it came out, you know. So, and you had one of the better SEC teams and one of the best Big Ten teams. So, yeah, I would make the argument it could potentially be the biggest upset of the playoffs.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is I think we had this conversation last week, and the answer was Clemson beating Texas would be the biggest upset. And we're saying, which says a lot about the advantage of being the 5 seed in the college football playoff.
Man. You're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, boys, let's move on to the next game on the slate, and that's the granddaddy of them all, the Rose Bowl. It's number 5, Ohio State, and number 1, Oregon. It is 5:00 on January 1st, ESPN, of course, in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. Ohio State is actually favored by 2.5 in this game, and they are the only lower seed to be favored. Notre Dame was favored originally, but that has flipped. And now Georgia is favored over Notre Dame by 1.5 or 2 points or whatever it is. And so, look, Ohio State leads the all-time series 9-2. Oregon has won the last 2. They beat Oregon in 2014 national championship game in the first ever playoff. So this is the big one. I think this is the one that people see maybe being the closest, maybe outside of Notre Dame, Georgia. But up to this point, with the 3 games that have been played, this one will be the one that people are looking the most forward to, I would imagine. And so, Brian, you are going to kick this off with Ohio State and how they got to.
I just want to say this first. I think it's fascinating how many people think that basically the championship game is going to be the winner of this game against the winner of the Notre Dame Georgia game. I'm not sure I quite have bought that just yet, but it is kind of interesting that people say that. I also want to say this too. I love the fact that this game is being played in the Rose Bowl. This is the best Pac-12 versus Big Ten game we've had in the Rose Bowl in a long freaking time.
And it's 2 Big Ten teams. So there you go.
No, Vince, it's a Pac-12 team and a Big Ten team, okay? Let me live in that for just a couple more days, okay?
Oh, man.
But how Ohio State got here, guys, this team, there's 2 teams that are in the playoff this year, 3 teams that are in the playoff right now that are just at the beginning of the season that everybody thought these are the 3 best teams in college football. And they're all here, right? It was Texas, Georgia, and Ohio State. In some order, most people thought these are the 3 best teams in college football, and they're all here. They're all playing. Now, for Ohio State, it was a little bit of an interesting journey, guys, that for the most part looked like what we thought it was preseason. Preseason, we sat here, Vince, you and I, we did our Big Ten previews, and I said, Ohio State's going to go 11-1. They're going to lose to Oregon in a close game in the regular season, and they're going to beat Oregon in a rematch in the Big Ten championship game. Yep. That's what I predicted. I did not see the Michigan game coming. I did not.
No one did.
And I think what happened in that game is that turned a lot of people off of Ohio State.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at Ohio State this season, guys, they start the season off with 5 straight blowouts. And they weren't always pretty. You know, Marshall game was a little bit ugly early, but they ended up rolling 49-14. That was after back 50-plus games. They outscored their 2 MAC opponents, start the season 108-6. Beat Marshall. Michigan State, they handled pretty good. Iowa was like 7-0 at halftime, and then they rolled them in the second half. Beat Nebraska in a really ugly game that I felt was a major trap game that was right between Oregon and Penn, and road games between Oregon and Penn State. Lost to Oregon by a point in a game that I felt was not as close as the final score showed. I think Oregon was the better team that day. They go on the road, they beat Penn State, and you kind of felt like that was the game that was going to launch Ohio State to the rest of the season because of the way they finished. Ohio State under Ryan Day has said this before, the further away they get from the Urban Meyer era, the less physical they become and the more finesse they become. And I watched that Penn State game, and it was a lot of the same. And then the fourth quarter of that game, they just basically said, we're going to run it at you, and there's not a dang thing you can do about it. And they iced that game, and there was nothing Penn State could do about it. And then Ohio State just kind of coasted over the next 3 games. They blow up Purdue, they blow out Northwestern. They whooped a good Indiana football team, and you're thinking, okay, Michigan's about to catch one. That 100 points that Ryan Day promised he was going to hang on Michigan a few years ago, I didn't realize. See, we were mistaken. He meant over the next 4 years we're going to score 100 points eventually in those 4 games.
Have they?
Close.
Okay.
Because they 10 this year. Last year they were at 24, so that's 34. 22, they're at 57. They actually haven't gotten there yet. 57. So they've scored 84 in the last 4 games.
Still 16 points shy. 4 years.
So
got it.
Eventually, by next year, maybe they'll get to 100 against Michigan. But that game obviously was a game where you watched it and you said, I don't know who that is. I watched that game and I still look back and say, I don't know who that team in Scarlet and Gray is, because that's not what we've seen all year. They went completely away from what got them there, and they went completely away from what they did against Tennessee in the first round. And Trevor said it, I believe, and was it you that said it, Trev, when we broke it was all ego. Yep. It was Ryan Day got punked by Michigan, and he was going to show that, no, we are tough, and he's not. And they went away from what got him there. And they got beat. And then once it started kind of going downhill, it just snowballed, and there was nothing they could do to get him out of that funk. They needed, and I said this about Notre Dame, guys. Best thing that ever happened to Notre Dame was losing Northern Illinois. I think the best thing that ever happened to Ohio State could be losing to Michigan, because I think it woke that team up a little bit. It says, hey, you're not as good as you think you are. from the standpoint of you can't just roll the ball out there and just beat teams the way you have the Big Ten every year for the last 5 years. And then when you finally get punched in the mouth, you don't respond well. And I think going in that Tennessee game, they needed time to rest. They needed time to heal. They came out in that Tennessee game. And from the start, fellas, you knew, like the first drive of the game, I said, oh, wow, Tennessee has no chance. Like Ohio State was pissed. You could see it, guys. They were pissed from the beginning of the game. Came out in the all scarlet. I'm like, oh, okay. Like they are fired up, just Will Howard dropping dimes, and they rolled Tennessee. And you're like, that's the team that we thought in the preseason we were going to get for most of the year. Is that right there? Played stifling defense, ran the ball enough to keep Tennessee honest, but just attacked them throwing the ball down the field. And their offensive line looked as good as they've looked in a while. Dominant game. Now we're going to find out over these next 3 games, was that just a one-off kind of it all went right? Or is Ohio State finally becoming the team that everybody thought they were going to be in the preseason? So how they got here, the team that we thought they were took a little bit of a twisted turn to get here. But in the first round of the playoff, guys, that Ohio State team that we thought we were going to see in the preseason showed up. And now we finally get that rematch that we thought we were going to see in the preseason as well against Oregon. And it's going to be in the flipping Rose Bowl, which I'm fired up about. Sure. Cannot wait to watch that game. I know that
good point.
We're going to be antsy waiting on the Notre Dame game, but just I love the fact that this game is being played in the Rose Bowl. And that's why I love the fact that the quarterfinal games are in bowls.
Yeah.
I just think that part of it is phenomenal. I love the fact that the Rose Bowl is going to have the best team from the Big Ten against the best team from the Pac-12. And for those of y'all that think I've lost my mind, I've not lost my mind. I know that Oregon's going to have a Big Ten logo here, but they're still a Pac-12 team. So let me just live in that as we get ready for the Rose Bowl. Okay, just let me have this one. Okay.
Oh boy, Trevor. Let's talk about those Ducks from whatever conference that they are now associated with. How did they get here to the Rose Bowl?
Yeah, man. I mean, I brought it up when we were talking about Boise State, but Oregon is the only undefeated team coming into this playoffs, and they, in conference play, along with Boise State, remained unscathed, and they avoided some of the monumental disasters that we saw some teams inherit in the month of November. Month of November was crazy, guys. Like in college football, you know, we were talking about it, and we were like, man, after October's over, like now it's, you know, we start looking at everybody's schedule, and it's like, okay, most likely teams are going to win out. You know, these teams are going to be playing in the conference championship. And when there's chaos to happen, it'll happen. And that's kind of my biggest takeaway of the season. But luckily for Oregon, that didn't happen. So they won the Big Ten title in a shootout against Penn State, 45-37, in a game that was never really that close. You know, Oregon held a 2-touchdown lead for most of the game. It was just Penn State could kind of never overcome that like 10-point hump, you know. But they had big wins over the regular season as well. You know, like there's a lot of teams out there that can go undefeated, but you go back and look at their schedules, like, yeah, they might not be that battle tested. They, you know, they blew out everybody that they played. They haven't had to win different styles of football games, you know, but they had a big win over Ohio State in the middle of October, 32-31. But it was weird for them, right? Like they struggled in the first 2 weeks. I mean, I remember looking at the score of the Idaho game, and I was like, what in the world? Like, because everybody was hyping up Oregon. They're like, they got, you know, Dan Lanning's coming back, and they have Dylan Gabriel, super experienced. Tez Johnson's back. Like, this is going to be a nasty football team. And they beat Idaho by 10 points, and they followed that up a week later by beating Boise State by 3 at home. I think the win over Oregon State is really kind of what got them going, and they got their feet under them, and they didn't really look back. They avoided disaster against Wisconsin. When they played them in Madison, they won 16-13. And, you know, Brian, you and I have had discussions about this of the mark of a good football team is being able to win different styles of game. And Wisconsin was able to take away what Oregon liked to do best. And it's like, okay, can you guys grind it out and win a low-scoring physical football game? And they showed that they could. Yeah, they finished their season rolling. Washington 49-21. That's an old Pac-12 rivalry, especially when you factor in what happened last year in the Oregon-Washington games. But, I mean, Oregon is kind of who they have been for a long time. They'll throw the ball all over the yard. They play with a lot of pace, not as fast as like the 2011, 2012 Chip Kelly offenses, but they like to get on the ball. They utilize their speed. They have great athletes at wide receiver. and they're being led by one of the hottest coaches in all of college football right now. Dan Lanning is 35-5. And that's really, really impressive. So, Oregon comes into this, and I think from a matchup perspective, it's going to look somewhat similar to what it did in the first game. Neither teams are overly physical. I think Oregon showed that they weren't that physical against Penn State. I mean, Penn State had 2 running backs over 100 yards rushing, and that was a question mark. Can Oregon handle Penn State's physicality? They couldn't, but the counter to that was Penn State could not hang with Oregon's speed. Now you have 2 teams with really electric weapons on the perimeter, and it's going to be a fun one, man. I mean, but that's been Oregon's journey to get here. It's relatively, I don't want to say boring, but when you're talking about a team that has no losses, it's pretty straightforward talking about what their path was to get here. So first year in the Big Ten, they came in and won the title, which I think that made Oregon was the first year in their conference. They won. Arizona State was the first year in their conference, and they won. SMU was their first year in their conference. They played for it, and Texas was the first year in that conference that they played for it. So makes for an interesting narrative overall, but Oregon's on the right track. So that's how they got here.
Boys, I think this matchup is fascinating, frankly. And I know that they've played once already. It's very difficult to win twice, obviously. I mean, that's how it usually goes when it comes to rematches and things of that nature. The rematch isn't always in the college football playoff, which, it obviously there's more on the line. And, what matchups are you guys kind of looking at here that are going to decide this game and the way it goes? Because depending on when you talk to me, for me personally, I go one way, I go another way. Like I'm not, I've got a score written down, but I'm not sure if that's what I'm sticking with. You know what I mean? Like that's how I am with this game. I don't feel that way about any of the other games that are going to be played in this round, but except for this one. So Brian, what are your thoughts on some of the matchups that could be key for this one?
I'm going to go with a storyline first, if that's okay.
No, absolutely.
I think one of the things that we have to, there are certain coaches who are being prescribed with can't win the big game, need to prove they can win the big game. Ryan Day is obviously one for Ohio State. James Franklin's another. There's a couple young coaches in this playoff that have to prove that they can do that as well, and another veteran coach that has to prove he can do that. What has Steve Sarkisian proven to get the benefit of the doubt that he can lead a team this deep? What has Marcus Freeman done to prove that he's a guy that can lead a team to a championship? What has Dan Lanning done to prove that? I mean, look, they had the 1 point home win over Ohio State. Great win. Don't get me wrong. It's a great win. But this is still a guy that's 0 against Kalen DeBoer, right? This is a guy that lost twice, I believe, to Utah in his first year, correct? Or was that the year before he got there, right? I mean, this is a guy that still has a lot to prove that he can win these big games, because what we're seeing with Dan Lanning and Marcus Freeman and Ryan Day and Steve Sarkisian, James Franklin, is these guys all have proven that they can beat teams where they have the better roster. What we're going to find out in this playoff is who are the coaches that can now take that next step as a coach. And that's an intriguing part of this. The winner of this game is going to get that. But I don't think we're talking about Dan Lanning in the same breath that we should. In that, has he really proven that he is a championship coach yet? No, he has not. Just like Marcus Freeman is not, because he's a young coach.
Well, not one. There's only one coach in the playoffs left has won a national championship.
Exactly, but not everybody gets talked about in the same breath, right?
That's fair.
Ryan Day has had more big wins than Dan Lanning and Marcus Freeman.
Fair.
Like, can we be honest about that? Now, he has lost to Michigan, but he's had his plenty of big wins, beating Penn State every year, So, yes, Ryan Day has got a lot to prove, and he hasn't proven that he can win many playoff games, but he did win one. They did beat Clemson in 2020. So a lot of these coaches have a lot to prove, and I think this game is, if Ryan Day wins, it not only gets a big monkey off of his back to a degree, but it also then maybe makes people start to question, like, okay, Dan Lanning's a great coach, but is he really that guy yet? Right? Because every time he goes against these top coaches, he catches L's more than he catches W's, right? When he goes against these other teams, and when the rosters that he's playing are on the par of his, can he win those football games? So I think that's an interesting storyline for both of these coaches. Getting to the football part of it, guys, I love this matchup. This is going to be a great matchup. And the rematch aspect of it is huge. My big thing is I just don't know that you can beat Ohio State twice in 1 year. That's a tall task, very tall task. And some of the things that obviously the game is going to be out west. I think that advantage Oregon. The fact that these Ohio State players haven't played in the Rose Bowl in several years, it's not like it used to be where they're playing in the Rose Bowl every year. That trip out west is going to be a little bit different. So I don't think that the neutral field necessarily favors Ohio State. I think it favors Oregon a little bit more. They've played in the stadium more recently when they play UCLA in the regular season. But then on the other side, guys, Oregon and Ohio State, to me, it's going to come down to Oregon gave you your best shot in the first game. They gave you your best shot. They pulled out all the stops. They're going to be more prepared for the deep ball. They're going to be more prepared for the speed of that Oregon offense. There's a lot of things that, like, you kind of showed your hand a little bit. Now the question is, can Jim Knowles and his defense actually stop it this time? I think that's the intriguing matchup. I think Ohio State can move the ball on Oregon if they play Ohio State football and stop trying to be something that you're not. And there's two great unknowns to me about this game, Trev. Number one, yes, we know Ohio State knows what to do to stop Oregon and the speed that Oregon has, but can they actually do it? And then the other side of the ball is, which version of Chip Kelly / Ryan Day shows up for this game? Is it the one that understands we should own the perimeter? Or is it the one that still feels like, hey, we got to pretend that we can run the ball because our pride got hurt when we got punked by Michigan 3 times in a row, now 4. That's the big question for me. And that before we even get into individual matchups, that coaching aspect right there, guys, for me is going to be very interesting.
I think that, gosh, this matchup is so tough to decide because it's a lot of the matchups we've talked about is like, can the speed of this team outlast the strength and size of this team? Like, the narrative of this is which team, I guess, can be the faster team. You know what I mean? Like that's why that's why Ohio State did what they did to Tennessee. They went back to, well, you're not a tough football team. Yeah, we know. Go guard Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith on the perimeter. You can't. You know what I mean? I think that's what's going to be interesting. I mean, Oregon kind of took that challenge head on when they played Penn State. It's like, hey, you're not going to be physical enough to beat us down in the trenches. Like, yeah, that's fine. Stop Tez Johnson. Stop our high-speed offense. And so now you have two very similar teams. To me, from a matchup perspective, I think what this is going to come down to is, can Ohio State generate pressure on the quarterback? You guys know how many sacks Ohio State had the first time against Dylan Gabriel?
I thought they had one. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you give a quarterback like that time to go back and sit in the pocket and give him time to set up shop back there. It doesn't matter how good your secondary is going to do. He's going to find somebody that's open. You know what I mean? Like, to your point, Brian, about the narratives of, are they going to resort back to old Ohio State? The one thing that kind of peaks in your mind is Quinshon Judkins in that game went 11 carries for 23 yards, averaged 2.1 yards per carry. So are they going to get in their feelings again about, hey, no, like we're going to establish the ground game, or are they going to do what got them to this point?
And if you do run the ball, give it to Travion. He better, first of all, he's a better running back. And I know that 100%. Travion can't handle the load, right? That the injuries have he's not a 20 carry back like we thought he was going to be as a freshman. I just think the injuries have kind of sapped him of that. I get that, but you don't have this elite offensive line. You have a line that has some experience and some veteran players. You can run the outside zones. You can run the misdirections. Get back to being that team, not this one that wants to run the ball downhill in the A and B gap. We saw that, and that's what we saw last week against Tennessee is some of the stretch stuff and getting Travion going. That's your horse. Like, that's your big play back. That's the guy that's going to get you here and get you to that next level, in my opinion, is Travion in the run game. Because I think he also complements Quinshon Judkins, the kind of hammer bulk carry guy, because he's a bulk carry guy. He needs lots of touches. I don't think that fits with what they need to be as an offense, Trevor. That's the thing for me. I think Travion is more of he's a lot like a Jeremiah Love, a Jadarian Price, where he may go 3, 2, -1, 5, 6, and then 70. You know what I mean? Like, I think he's the guy you've got to build this thing around in this matchup, Vince. I don't know if you agree with that, Vince. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but to me, guys, that's the big key for me is Travion's got to be more of a focal point of this game plan, much more so than he was in the game they played earlier in the season. And we saw that against Tennessee, and that's why he ripped off a couple big runs. I think that's a big key is do they try to be the ground and pound in the box, or do they say, hey, we're a fast team, let's play fast?
I think if you're Ohio State, I think you want to be a little bit of both. I think you do want to ground and pound it, but I do think they also want to play a little bit fast. I mean, Trevor, you mentioned, earlier when you were talking about how Oregon got to where they are and all of that, how they can kind of win games in different ways, right? They can win it by chucking the ball over the place. They can win it by punching you in the mouth and going with the slow, drag it out, like they did against Wisconsin. I still think Ohio State's best avenue to win the game is to play the game like Wisconsin. You want to run the ball. You want to punch them in the mouth. You want to be the more physical team. That's what you want to do. Now, it's going to be up to Oregon on how they respond to that.
You think that's what Ohio State wants to do? Is that what you said?
I think that's what they should do. I don't know if that's what they want to do, because for me, look, Will Howard played great in the last game they played. Up until that point, I wasn't a big Will Howard believer that he could put the team on his back and do some different things. I think it's going to be different in the Rose Bowl, on the road, bowl game, big, even bigger stage, not at home, those kinds of things. I don't know if you want to put it all on Will Howard. I just don't know that that's really the game plan that you want to have. Now, he's going to have to make some plays, absolutely. But I don't think the game plan should be, if you're Chip Kelly and you're Ryan Day, I don't think the game plan is 18 is going to win it for us. I just don't think that's what I don't think that's a safe bet, in my opinion. Now, I could be completely wrong.
I mean, I get where you're coming from. Look, I think he played phenomenal last week.
He did.
I don't think that's a repeatable performance, but I think you're gonna need him to do that though. Like, could they run the ball on Oregon? Sure, they can, but not playing in, just my opinion, the ground and pound style. It's balancing it with your throwing game. No, Will Howard's not a stud, but you've got a phenomenal receiving core. I mean, Cardinal Tate's a starter on anyone else, like a number one, at worst number two guy on every team that Ohio State's played this year other than Oregon. I mean, he's the number one receiver at Penn State. He's the number one receiver he'd be the number one receiver for Notre Dame. Like, he's a dude, right? I mean, the other kid that they have, the sophomore, they had the kid from Florida, he's a dude. And they're 3 and 4 on this receiving core. And that's the problem, is your best part of your team is your pass catchers. And that's where I think Oregon is most vulnerable, is being able to throw the ball vertically. What I think Ohio State did a pretty decent job of against Tennessee is they came out and went to that. It was off tackle, some downhill, and then throwing the ball down the field. That's kind of my big thing, is I need to see more of that. I just don't think they have the offensive line to be a ground and pound team. I don't think they have that unit with all the injuries they've had up front. They don't have Seth McLaughlin anymore. He's out for the year. They're All-American center. I don't know that they're a team that physically can do that against a team like Oregon. You're going to have to get the ball on the perimeter. I think you're going to have to stretch the field. You're going to have to get Travion the ball. I think that's a mistake they made in the first game, is they tried to run downhill at Oregon, and they just don't have the horses to do that. And Quinshaw Judkins, to me, is just not that dude. Maybe he will be this game. But I saw that guy take several short yardage, guys about to hit him, curl up in the fetal position and take the hit, including a 4th and 1. And I don't know that Travion's the guy you want to be doing that with either, because I don't want him to get hurt. But, man, he to me is the secret weapon. Not the secret weapon. He's not a secret.
X factor.
There you go. He's the X factor. If they get him going, I don't know that Oregon it's going to become a shootout. And I don't know if you can win a second shootout against Ohio. It's like USC did what they did in Notre Dame that one game, but if they play a month later, USC's not scoring 35 on Notre Dame.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right? And that's the thing with Oregon, is can they do that? I have a lot more faith. And I guess, Trev, this is where ultimately we'll get to the prediction, but this is ultimately where I think this game comes down to. I have more faith in Ohio State's defense to make the key stops in this game on a neutral field than I do Oregon's on a neutral field. That's a big thing for me. I think this is a more proven Ohio State off defense. And now the other part is, but they've played 2 now in a row pretty slow, methodical offenses. We talked about this last week, guys. Tennessee does not have the offense people think they do. They're they're a team that hasn't scored many points in 2 months, right? And this is going to be a different level of speed. Does Ohio State need another adjustment period in this game, kind of like they did the last time they played? And will the offense be able to keep them in the game? But I think that's the thing for me is if it comes down to which offense do I think is better, and I have more faith in Oregon's offense because of the quarterback. But the gap between the offenses is a lot closer than in my opinion, the gap between the two defenses. That's a big part of this matchup for me, Trev.
Yeah, I mean, for me, for the matchup, I'm glad you brought up the defense because I think that's going to be more telling of what happens in this game. Like, I have no question that Ohio State's offense is going to be able to move the ball and put points on the board. But in their first matchup, you came away with 0 sacks, and your number one corner got absolutely cooked. 7 targets, 7 receptions, $143 on the ground, and 2 touchdowns. So was that a fluke? Or is that what happens when Denzel Burke plays a really fast wide receiver? You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's going to be interesting to me what narrative kind of comes out there, because I have no question that Jeremiah Smith and Egbuka and Travion Henderson and that offense is going to be able to move the ball. Yeah. I mean, Penn State hung 37 points on this defense, and I think that Ohio State's offense is significantly better than Penn State's offense. I do.
Yep.
But I don't know what version of Ohio State's defense that we are going to see. If you can get after Dillon Gabriel, and if Denzel Burke can just literally allow half of what he gave up the first game, I think they're going to be fine. Like, I am willing to believe that if you look at his performances over the season and you look at it, it is the outlier. But the other thing that's also the outlier is he didn't face another receiver like Evan Stewart that season, right? So what is it gonna be? Like, they haven't faced another quarterback like Dillon Gabriel this year. What is that going to look like for them? That's what it comes down to for me.
I think we're going to find out, was that just a bad game for that defense, or is this what happens when they play speed? I think it's a great observation. I mean, I tend to think it was more of a bad game, like Christian Gray had against USC.
Sure.
That's what I think. Because I saw him doing things where he was getting grabby. He was like you could tell that the speed gave him a problem because of who they had played coming into that game. So even though they haven't played any speed since then, there's a difference between you just played Iowa, Michigan State, Marshall, Western Michigan, and Akron coming into that game, and now where you've played Penn State, Purdue, Northwestern, Indiana, Michigan, and Tennessee coming into this game. I think that's a big thing for me. And because you have the time off, you got a lot more chances to go good on good in practice that first week and a half of practice.
Sure.
Where now let's go have Denzel have to cover Emeka and Jeremiah for that first week of practice and some 7-on-7s and help them get used to that speed. So I do think Ohio State's going to be better prepared for that. But to your point, you can know it's coming, and they're going to throw a go ball to Jeremiah Smith. It doesn't mean you can cover him, right? You may know that they're going to run this route to Tez Johnson. Doesn't mean you can cover him. And I think that's a great observation, and it's going to be a big part of this game, guys. Is Ohio State's defense what I think it is? If it is, I think the Buckeyes win because I think they're going to make more stops. I don't think they're going to shut Oregon down.
No,
really good Oregon offense. This is going to be like a 34-10 game unless Oregon just lays an egg. That can always happen to anybody. This is like when Florida did that to Ohio State back in 2006. If they play a week later, Ohio State scores a lot more on that Florida team than they did in the 2006 title game. That's how football goes sometimes, right? But who's going to make the big stop to you're up 7. They're trying to tie it late in the first half. You make a stop. You get a field goal, and instead of it being a tie game, you're now up 10, right? Or you go up 7, you go up 4. Your defense makes a stop. You get your offense the ball back, and you can put the game away. Which defense can make the most stops? And right now, that's ultimately where I'm going down to. Is I think both of these offenses, when they're on, are really good. Oregon's has been more, I'd say, more consistent. Although the game because Ohio State looks phenomenal at times, and then at times. Oregon's has rarely looked phenomenal. I thought it looked phenomenal against Penn State, but it's usually just really good. And it's other than Wisconsin hasn't had a lot of those, what the heck was that moments. Ohio State's been more up and down. The Ohio State defense is, to me, the key in this game. But I think your point, Trevor, is spot on. Name me an offense that's similar to what Oregon's is that they faced since then. And I would say Indiana's. I mean, I do think Indiana has a good talent on offense, but it's still nothing like what Oregon's speed-wise. And that's going to be I think that's a very, very intriguing part of this matchup, Trev. I think that's a spot-on analysis.
All right, boys, let's hit the prediction train. Brian, lead us off.
I got Ohio State winning the rematch, guys. I'm going to stick with what I said in the preseason. I said Oregon is going to win the regular season game. Ohio State's going to win the postseason rematch. I thought it'd be the Big Ten title game. It's a playoff game instead. Right. It's the Rose Bowl. Look, I'm not someone that believes that Ohio State all of a sudden figured it out and they're going to be that team against Tennessee. I don't think Tennessee was as good as people made them out to be. I think that we thought that if Ohio State showed up, they could win that game and win that game convincingly. We just weren't sure if they're going to show up. I don't know that this is something they can do for 4 straight games, but they don't need to. They don't need to play like that to keep winning games. If they play like that, they'll blow everybody they play out until the title game. Because I think Georgia and Notre Dame would both give them competitive games and not let them play quite like that. But I still think this is a really talented football team that if you take away the Michigan game, no one's surprised that Ohio State's the favorite in this game. And if I'm as a Notre Dame fan, I have to be honest and consistent about that because I can't just say, well, I'm going to hold that Michigan game against them because otherwise then I'd have to say, well, I'm going to hold the Northern Illinois game against Notre Dame. I'm going to go with who they were on all but one weekend. And all but one weekend, that Ohio State offense was pretty good and showed that they could do what they needed to do. You could maybe throw the Penn State game in there, but I think Penn State's got a better defense than Oregon does. I think Michigan's got a better defense than Oregon does. I don't know that Oregon has what it takes to slow down Ohio State enough. The big key is going to be for Oregon, can they force Will Howard into mistakes? That's going to be the big key. I don't know that they're going to be able to do enough of it. At least I think they're going to be countered by the mistakes that Ohio State forces Dylan Gabriel into. And that's what's going to come down to. So I have Ohio State winning 35-31. I think this is going to be a great game. I think this is 2 excellent football teams. I think the 4 best teams in the playoff right now are these 2 teams in Notre Dame and Georgia. I think those are the 4 best teams in the playoff right now. They're both going to play. I think it's going to be a great game. I just think Ohio State has too much firepower combined with the better defense. That's why I'm going with the Buckeyes to win 35-31. Plus, guys, this is what I predicted in the preseason, that they would win the rematch, and there's nothing that I've seen that makes me think that that's going to change. Can Oregon win? Absolutely, Oregon can win this game. I just think Ohio State's the better team.
Yeah, our score predictions are almost identical. I have Ohio State winning 34-31. I think Oregon's going to get the ball at the end of the game with a chance to win, and that's when the defense steps up. But like I brought up before, I don't know if I'm willing to bet that Denzel Burke is going to allow the same thing. I don't know if Ohio State's defense is not going to get a single sack. You know, Ohio State's defense also didn't force a turnover, I don't think, in that game either. So, you know, it's going to be one of those where I don't know if that's going to be able to happen again. You know what I mean? Like, I don't feel confident, especially with this being a rematch, walking away saying that Ohio State's going to get no sacks, no turnovers, get outrushed, outpassed again. I don't. And with this being more of a neutral site game, you factor all those things in, Ohio State ended up losing by 1 point, you know, with an opportunity to win at the end of the game. So I'm taking the Bucks in this one. I do think that some of the teams, and this is overall, I think some of the teams that had the bye week are going to experience some of the rust that the round 1 playoff teams did. Like, I think playing in round 1 is going to be a benefit to teams like Notre Dame and Ohio State because they got to get some of that out. They got to get some of the rust out, whereas these teams have been sitting now at the time of kickoff for 25 days. So, yes, on one hand, you have, you know what, like they got the rest. They're back healthy. All of that is true. They also haven't played a snap of football in almost a month. So I think Ohio State's rolling. I think that win over Tennessee is going to propel them forward, and I think they're going to win in a close one, 34-31.
Vince, we're going to go to you next, but when you finish, there is a question I want to ask you two guys before we move on to the Notre Dame Georgia game.
Okay. So my prediction, I'm in the same neighborhood as you guys as with a close game. There's no doubt about it. I think it's going to be a little bit more low scoring. I guess my faith is in the Ohio State defense and what they're going to be able to do, and my lack of faith in Will Howard. So I've got a little bit more low scoring, but I still think Ohio State's going to win. And so I've got it 24-21. So I think Ohio State will score enough. And I do think Ohio State, you talked about that big stop, when that's going to happen, who's going to make it. I think Ohio State gets that big stop at the end of the game to win the game. I think the defense wins the game for them, to be honest with you. So 24-21 Ohio State over Oregon. So what's your question, boss?
If Ohio State wins, I think, barring them just getting destroyed in one of the final 2 games, something will happen. I think some of the pressure comes off of Ryan Day. Right, getting to the semifinals. Now you're either going to lose to Texas or Notre Dame or Georgia, most likely. Right, if you don't win it all, you're losing. And I think that's kind of respectable. Does the pressure get turned back up on him if they lose this game? Like, do you think they go right back to where it was pre-Tennessee, or do you think the blowout of Tennessee was enough to kind of say, okay, let's just chill out. Let's see if we can go beat Michigan next year and kind of see how it goes, or do you think it ramps back up? I'm curious what you guys think. The storyline in Columbus is going to be if they lose this game. I mean, obviously part of it's how they lose. So
sure.
Not like a blowout, but let's just say it's
Close
a good football game and Oregon just is the better team in the fourth quarter.
Look, we've got some Ohio State fans in the chat, so I'm curious as to what they think about this because they're the fans, short for fanatic.
But
so
they're also, especially Archer, they're a little bit more reasonable.
Well,
than
most
maybe
of the time,
your average Buckeye.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think the win over Tennessee was huge for Ryan Day, even though it was at home. I get it, but there were plenty of people calling for Tennessee to win that game, and they had the stadium takeover and the whole deal. So winning that game in the manner that they won that game, I think, got a lot of people off of his back. Losing this game in the short term will not be good. There will be a lot of talk going on. The best thing that could happen for Ryan Day is the offseason at that point, because now people are going to be focused on other games, other things, and then he'll kind of be able to coast into the offseason. If he gets blown out here, it's going to be a lot louder, obviously, but I do think that Tennessee game does hold some sway, and I think it kind of quieted some things down a little bit. So if they lose, they got to lose close. They absolutely have to lose close.
I think it ramps back up, just not to the degree that it was before Tennessee in any loss, because I think when you do this, you have to look at the season as a whole. And I've been saying this for the last couple of weeks with the team that they put together and the players that they convinced to come back and the coordinator that they hired on offense and Jim Knowles going into his 3rd year. The minimum expectation was you beat Michigan, you win the Big Ten, and you go on a playoff run. And right now they're 0-2, and they're on their way to making a playoff run.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a loss is kind of like, okay, you beat a team at home convincingly. But
Right.
Brian, I'm in the same boat as you of I didn't think Tennessee was as good as what people made them out to be. I did not see that being a 25-point game.
Exactly. Exactly.
I will admit that. I expected that game to be close, low scoring. The narrative still being, I didn't think
if
Tennessee
the Buckeyes whooped them, it'd have been like 34-20.
Right. I did not see it being 42-17. With it never, ever, ever, ever being that close, right? That was an impressive win. So I think that win kind of cushioned it a little bit. But I think once I'm actually going a little bit opposite of Vince, I think it'll sting a little bit at first in that, oh man, I wish we could have made the playoff run. And then I think once time settles and the dust settles a little bit and people look at the season as a whole, it's like, yo, this season should have been so much better than no Big Ten championship, no win over Michigan, and 1 playoff win. I think that's when it'll start to sink in, and I think the noise will start to ramp up a little bit. But that Tennessee win definitely bought Ryan Day a lot more time. I really do. So I think it ramps back up, but not to the height that it was before Tennessee.
I think if they lose this game in any fashion, the heat's gonna be back on them. But I don't think it's gonna be as hot as it was before the Tennessee game. I'm kind of in the middle. I think that there's gonna be pressure on him. I think he'll go into next season a bit on, I don't know, hot seat, but definitely warmed up seat for sure going into next season. And then it's going to be like, dude, you not only better beat Michigan and win the Big Ten, but you better get to the championship game. I think that's going to be sort of the conversation next year. Because, I mean, if you think about it, guys, you haven't won a neutral site playoff game since 2020, right? And then that's the only one that you have won. They lost to Clemson in 19 in the first round. You beat Clemson in the next year, but then got blown up by Bama. You didn't make it in 21. 22, you made it. Yeah, you played a great game against Georgia, but you still got beat. and then you didn't make it in 23, and you lost to an SEC team in the playoff. Like, the postseason has not been good to Ohio State under Ryan Day, and like you say, he hasn't won a Big Ten title since 2020. I do think the pressure comes back up. I just don't think it reaches the boil that it was pre-Tennessee, because it was just the nature of losing to Michigan. But I do think going into next year, you're like, dude, you lost in the quarterfinals. You know what I mean? Like to the same team twice, a new team in the Big Ten. Like, you're not even the best team. You're not even the second best team in the Big Ten right now. You're the third best team in the Big Ten, because you still can't beat Michigan, and Michigan's won a title, so they're still ahead of you as a program. I know they weren't as good this year, but they still beat you. The worst Michigan team since 2020 still beat you this year, and I think that's gonna be at home, by the way, at home in Columbus.
Yeah.
So I think the Heat does go back up, but I think if he wins this game, as long as the game they lose afterwards isn't a blowout, I think the Heat's off, and it's like, okay, calm down, everybody. They're going to be okay, right? And then it may ramp up if you lose to Michigan again next year, but I think that at least takes some of that burden off, and people will calm down and be like, okay, look, this is because I think at that point in time, Trev, they kind of look around like, guys, look what's happening in college football right now.
Sure.
I mean, look what's happening to some of these teams. And yeah, Ryan Day's not winning at all, but the steadiness is something to be admired in this era where you can go 13-1 one year and 2-10 the next.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I think it comes down to the roster conversation. Like, that's how, at least personally, that's how I look at it. If you can't win and make a run with this roster, I mean, what roster are you going to do that with? Because to me, that comes down to coaching. I mean, look at who they're losing. They're going to lose both their running backs. Will Howard's gone. Igbuka's gone. On defense, you're losing Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tylik Williams, Denzel Burke, Lathan Ransom, Cody Simon. Like, if you're not going to do it with them, like, what's going to be the backup for Ryan Day? It's like, well, just wait till next year. And it's like, to when you have who? Still great athletes, right? Like, it's not like they're going to replace them with a bunch of bums. But you have experience, you have athleticism, you have size, you have speed. If that's not going to do it, we're just supposed to trust that you're going to do it with not those guys.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
What if Ohio State wins this game and then loses to Arizona State?
Honestly, I think that would just be like, guys, you lost to because then Arizona State's in the title game. And I think the perception of Arizona, look, guys, they beat Texas. They beat you. You beat Oregon. You beat Tennessee. I think there'd be disappointment, but I think the hot seat talk. Like, look, if Notre Dame, Georgia, Ohio State, or Texas don't win the title, there's going to be disappointment. But disappointment's different than this bum's got to go, which is kind of the narrative after the Michigan game. I think if you win this game, it doesn't matter what happens next, barring an embarrassing blowout to somebody.
Right.
Like, I think if they play Notre Dame in the title game and just get rolled, or play Georgia and get rolled, or Texas beats them in the semis and get rolled, I think then maybe you start to hear that ramp up a little bit. But having wins over Penn State on the road, Tennessee at home, and Oregon on a neutral field would be enough to say, guys, Ohio State's going to be fine. Take a deep breath. This is a new world of NIL and all this other kind of stuff. They're going to be okay. Even with a loss, because then you lost in the semifinals to a team that made the championship game. It's like Michigan losing to, and that's what a lot of Ohio State fans are going to say. Hey, guys, remember when Michigan lost to TCU, a team that had no business being a Big 12 team? Want to remember what they did the next year? You guys remember what Michigan did the next year? Won a title. You're going to hear that spin, and honestly, it's legitimate spin. I mean, that's a fair thing to say. If you beat Oregon, I think that calms everything down.
Okay.
There's still going to be some people that don't like Ryan Day, but it's not going to be the same. He's got to go. They're going to replace him with Freeman. They're going to replace him with Vrabel. They're going to replace him with John Gruden. They're going to replace him with Nick Saban. Heck, Urban Meyer's going to come back. I'm being sarcastic with some of those names, but you guys get the point, right? I literally heard someone say Urban Meyer might come back and coach him again. I'm like, okay, sure. Let's go with that. But yeah, I just was curious. I thought that's an interesting. I think this is a big game, and I think Archer said it. We said at the beginning, if Ohio State wins, I do think people start finally asking the question about Dan Lanning. Can he truly actually win the big games?
Yeah.
Because then his only big game win is a home regular season win over Ohio State, and then a neutral field win over a coach who has literally proven he can't win games like that his entire career, and James Franklin, right? I think we start asking that question about Oregon now. So it'll be interesting because I'd say the same thing. If not now, when? You couldn't do it with Bo Nix.
Right.
You can't do it with Dylan Gabriel. You got Tess Johnson. You got Evan Stewart. You got all this talent. If you can't do it now, when? I think that's true for a lot of teams in the playoff right now, especially these two in Texas. I think those three teams have more pressure on them than anybody else in the playoff. Because like Georgia's like, guys, we don't have our starting quarterback. Notre Dame can be like, look, we're down like 7 starters to season-ending injuries. We've gotten further, blah, blah, blah. I think there's more pressure on Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon to make a deep run and win it all than there is anybody else in the playoff, which only adds to the excitement about this particular game. So good talk. Thanks for indulging me in that conversation, fellas.
No problem. All right, let's spin it forward to the final game of this round. That would be the Sugar Bowl, which pits number 7 Notre Dame against number 2 Georgia. That takes place on January 1st at 8:45 in the evening on the East Coast on ESPN. Of course, that game is in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the Superdome. Georgia at the present is a 2-point favorite. Notre Dame has never beaten Georgia. Georgia leads the all-time series 3-0. So, Brian, how do the Bulldogs get to the Sugar Bowl?
Well, guys, they're a lot like Ohio State, right? This is what they were supposed to do. This is where they were supposed to be. Coming into the season, you expected Georgia to be one of those teams. We heard all last year, if Georgia would have made the playoffs last year, they'd have beat Michigan and all these other type of things. Who knows? Maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't have. But you also came into the season saying, guys, could the schedule be too much could it be the thing that keeps them from getting to that point? That was an honest question. That was a fair question. Could that be the thing that keeps them from getting to it? And guys, it almost did, but I think the schedule allowed them to be challenged in a way from start to finish in a way that nobody else was. And that's what's got them here. You start the season off, guys, with a neutral field win over Clemson. It was 6-0 at halftime. And then Georgia took that game over in the second half. You have an ugly win 2 weeks later over Kentucky, but they did grind it out. And then you started to see some of the chinks in the armor a little bit, fellas. They have a bye week, go into Bama with a bye, had a bye, and Bama jumps out to a 28-0 lead. But then you also see the chinks in the armor, but then you also saw something in that game that showed why Georgia is still playing and Alabama is not. Because even though they fell behind 28-0 and were getting dominated, that team never quit. Never quit. They kept fighting. They kept battling, and that's going to be a theme all year, fellas. Same thing against Kentucky. We saw them lose that game late. Again, shaky pass secondary cost them that game, but they took a late fourth quarter lead in a game they were behind to Bama by 4 touchdowns. Ugly win over Auburn, ugly win over Mississippi State, and then a dominant win over Texas on the road. Ugly win over Florida. They then got dominated by Ole Miss. They lost 28-10. Now, their defense did force Ole Miss to settle for a lot of field goals in that game, which helped them. But the only touchdown that Georgia had in that game, Vince, was first drive of the game. They pick Ole Miss off and run it back, and they score on a short field. And they still had to kind of work to get that one and really never truly threatened Ole Miss again the rest of the game. And then what do? They bounce back the next week. It's tied 17-17 against Tennessee. And in the second half of that game, they absolutely dominated Tennessee. Sloppy win over UMass, but still won by 30. There's a lot of teams that would love to have sloppy 38-point wins. And then the Georgia Tech game comes, and it's more of the same. You see the chinks in the armor. They're vulnerable to teams who can get to the perimeter. This is not as fast of a Georgia defense as we've seen in past years, especially on the third level. You have a team that is vulnerable to being run at by good running attacks, a team that struggles with mobile quarterbacks, in my opinion, in that game. And they fall behind 17-0. And we can talk all we want about how the refs helped Georgia out, and they did. But they also still had to come back from a 17-0 deficit and make the plays needed to get back in it and come back and win that game in 8 overtimes. And then we see the same thing against Texas. They're down 9-3 at halftime, thoroughly outplayed by Texas in the first half. Lose their starting quarterback on the last play of the first half. Come out the second half, and once again, this Georgia team is said, we are not going to quit. We're not going to stop fighting. Come back, win that game in overtime. The biggest takeaway from this Georgia team for me, guys, is no, this is not as dominant of a Georgia team as people thought it was going to be coming into the season. But the reason they're here now is because they have the heart of a champion. This team does not stop fighting. They don't. And that's why they're here. You could point to their skills, well, they should have lost that game. They should have lost that game. But they didn't, because this team has no quit in them. And y'all know I'm not a big Kirby Smart fan in a lot of ways. But the one thing that I give him a ton of credit for is he has had this team ready to fight for 60 minutes every single time they take the field. They don't always play well, but they battle, they fight. And that's, to me, why they're here and why they're on this stage where they've got a chance to once again go play for national championships. So that's how Georgia got here, fellas.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is a fun narrative, again, between two teams that have had to continually battle and battle and battle. Just for Notre Dame, it's looked a little different. For some of our avid listeners out there, you guys know the story. Notre Dame starts out hot. They go down into the daunted SEC country where just nobody else besides the SEC can win. And they go into Kyle Field and beat Texas A&M by 10 points, and they were 3-point dogs before kickoff, right? And that's when all the noise started creeping in. That's when it was, Notre Dame is the favorite now to make the playoffs, and then they might go undefeated. And what have we learned throughout this season? We learned throughout the season that teams have struggled handling success. It happened to Notre Dame. It happened to Alabama. It happened to Miami. It happened with countless teams.
Georgia.
Yep, happened to Georgia. It happened to a lot of different teams. Now, I will say the different narrative is Notre Dame loses to Northern Illinois. They suck. They don't belong. The other teams, it's, well, they just weren't able to handle success. It's a fluke. Another conversation for another show. But Notre Dame has been ascending ever since September 7th at 7:30 p.m. And that showed, and now they're winners of 11 straight games. 10 of those have been by double digits. So regardless of what people feel about Notre Dame, you can't deny just the football factor. If I remove the name from it, if I take Notre Dame Fighting Irish off of it, and I tell you that there's a team that has won 11 straight games, 10 of them by double digits, they've forced a minimum of one turnover in every game, and in that span of time, they're averaging over 40 points a game, you're not going to tell me that they suck and don't belong. You know what I'm saying? But that's where Notre Dame is at. They've had notable wins this season over Texas A&M, over Louisville, over Navy and Army. And I'm going to throw USC in there too because they're 2-0 this season against the SEC. So calling a spade, it is what it is.
SEC teams, by the way. Both 8-win SEC teams.
Yep. But with that being said, one of the reasons why they got here and one of the big reasons why they got here has been a handful of things. You can look at Riley Leonard's progression. And a lot of Notre Dame fans were counting out number 13 before their first bye. And to be honest, some of it was rightfully so. Once you start factoring in the fact that he missed spring and he might be not that healthy and the ankle might not be that good to go. He injured his shoulder.
Slide route.
That's what I'm saying. He can't, all of these things. And he's shades of who he was against, when he was at Duke. But his progression has been huge. Obviously, you have to factor in the running back's dominance. Notre Dame has the best running back duo in the country, and I would put up that argument against any team. That's not specific to Georgia. It's not specific to anybody that we've talked about today. But if you just look at the numbers and the defensive perseverance, we talked a lot about how Georgia has had to battle adversity on and off the field. Same thing with Notre Dame. Notre Dame has been playing in playoff elimination games since September 7th after that loss. And right now in those games, they're 11-0. And that's a team that is hot coming into the playoffs. However, it came with a lot of injuries. Brian kind of briefly touched on what that looked like for them. They're down Riley Mills, both of their starting Vipers, their All-American corner, their starting presumed left tackle going into the season. They have a who was probably going to be a true freshman All-American in Kingston Viliamasa, but he was injured to finish the season. And so they're
Still
down. They're down so many guys, and yet they're still here. And so the reason why I think this matchup in this game is going to be so awesome is because you have two teams who at any point in the season could have folded because they just kept being told that they shouldn't be here. They're not who everybody thought they were going to be. And here they are squaring off in the quarterfinals with a bid going to the semifinals at stake and a win in the Sugar Bowl on the line. So all of this is going to be really, really fun. I do think it's fitting that the first time that these teams played was in 1981 in the Sugar Bowl. and Georgia ended up winning 17-10. It was Dan Devine's last game. So there's a lot of different narratives that are going to be tossed around here, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. These are two really physical football teams. I know we're about to dive into the matchup here in a second, but that's Notre Dame's journey to get here, man. I mean, there is so many times that this team could have folded and quit and hung in the towel, just like Georgia could have. Georgia could have done it down that much against Alabama. They could have done it down 17. They could have done it when Carson Beck was injured in the SEC championship game, and they never did.
While losing.
Yes.
They were down when he got hurt. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Georgia's an opponent where, albeit I have disagreements with their fans almost every day on Twitter. And like Brian, I'm not the biggest Kirby Smart supporter, but this team has my respect, man. They don't quit. They're a team that is going to play until there's double zeros on the clock. So this is going to be a really, really fun matchup to dive into, man.
All right, boys. So let's break this one down a little bit and kind of how we did the other 3 games. Storylines, matchups. We're not going to do a prediction on this game. We're going to have a special show.
And hold off on that until next week.
We will.
What do you guys think about us at least saying who we think is going to win? So that way we don't leave people hanging.
I think they got to tune into the next one, but that's me. So we're not going to make any specific predictions. I'll say that. And because we're going to do a whole show on that. But your overall thoughts on this game, some matchups that stick out to you, some storylines that stick out to you, that kind of thing. Brian, I'll let you go first.
Biggest storyline is from the Notre Dame standpoint, guys. It's okay. This is the kind of game you haven't been able to win for a very, very long time. Look, they've beaten some big time programs in the last decade. They've beaten Florida State. They've beaten Oklahoma. In the last 15 years, they've beaten LSU. They've beaten Clemson. They've beaten some of those teams. They've never beat them in years where those teams were elite. The year that they beat Clemson in 2022, that was not an elite Clemson team. The year that they beat every year they beat Florida State's been bad. They haven't, unfortunately, been able to play. The last time they played a good Florida State team was back in 2014, and they lost that football game. And that's a phenomenal game, went down to the wire. They played Georgia twice, and when Georgia was really good and lost both times. Both very competitive football games, lost both times. An L is an L, right? I know as much as the previous head coach tried to argue for the good loss narrative, this is Notre Dame. There are no good losses at Notre Dame, right? It's either you win or you lose. And so for Notre Dame, it's, okay, do you belong on the stage? Well, yeah, of course you belong. All right, cool. So you're here again, 4th time in the last 13 years, 14 years. But can you get over that hump? That's the biggest storyline. Can you get over that hump? The Indiana game was a huge win for Notre Dame, but it wasn't the monkey off your back scenario because A, it was at home, and B, it was Indiana. And here's the thing that frustrates me about this conversation with Indiana is you can say that's not a program-moving, needle-moving win and still say Indiana's a really good football team, and you beat a really good football team, but you were supposed to beat Indiana. This is the game that people don't know if you can win or not. And so that's the biggest storyline for me is Notre Dame goes into this game. Yes, they're beat up. Georgia's playing without their backup quarterback. So let's get the injury stuff out of the conversation now and then just talk about who can win this football game. And that's going to come down to it is what's the storyline? Because, again, we see it from one of our resident SEC fans in here that just no chance Notre Dame wins a game like this, right? And so, there's some national analysts and some Georgia analysts who I think understand this is a good football team for Notre Dame, but I still think they all expect Georgia to win this game because Notre Dame has not proven they can win this type of game. And that, to me, is the biggest storyline, guys, is until Notre Dame can win a game like this, that narrative exists. That's why I say, look, Bama and Georgia fans can talk all the trash they want about Notre Dame because they've beat Notre Dame. Ohio State fans can talk all the trash they want about Notre Dame because Notre Dame hasn't beaten those teams. I don't want to hear crap from LSU fans. I don't want to hear crap from Michigan fans or Penn State, teams that Notre Dame has beat. These are the teams that you haven't been able to beat. And until you can beat one of those teams, guys, then the narrative exists. It's going to remain. And so that's really the biggest thing at stake beyond a chance to go play in the college football semifinals, right? It's also that for Notre Dame, it's that narrative. And for Georgia, it's just keep on rolling. You're that team. You are the new dominant program in college football. You don't have to win it every year to be the dominant team in college football. And that's what they are. They are the dominant team in college football. And they are a championship contender. So this is the first chance. This is the most recent chance, guys, I would say, since Ohio State early last year. You could even maybe argue Ohio State 2022. whether you could debate whether or not Ohio State last year was actually a championship contender. I don't think that they were. I think you'd have to go back to 22 Ohio State with C.J. Stroud to say the last time you played a true that team can win it all, and you lost. Prior to that, it was going back to Bama in 2020. I don't think Cincinnati 2021 was a legit – they were a playoff team, but they weren't a title contender. Indiana's a legit playoff team. They're not a title contender. Georgia's both. And so for Notre Dame, the big storyline is, can you finally beat a team like that? Can this be your moment where they've all had them? Georgia had to beat Bama to get here. That was their kryptonite. You know, I mean, when you think about, you know, Clemson to win theirs, they had to get their kryptonite was Florida State and South Carolina, and then it became Bama, right? And so they beat that real good Notre Dame team in 2015, which Dabo has always said is the game that kind of started that program's final ascent over the hump. And then, of course, the next year went out and beat Bama in the title game. So every team has had to have that moment. LSU in 2019 had to beat Bama. All those good LSU teams, the 11 team, they had some great teams. They could never beat Bama. And then the one year they did beat Bama in 11, they had to play them in a rematch, and they got smoked in the title game. And they had to beat Bama that year. And it was a great game, jumped on them big. Bama came back. You know, LSU closed them out. That was your kryptonite. That was that dragon you had to slay. Can Notre Dame slay that dragon in this game? I think that's the without question the biggest storyline of this game, and I would argue the biggest storyline of the quarterfinals, even beyond the Ryan Day stuff. This to me is the potential for the biggest mountainous, like seismic shift in college football. If Notre Dame wins this game, if they lose this game, it's just kind of like, okay, the world is what it always has been.
Yep,
Notre Dame's good, but they're not that team. And Georgia is. So let's move on and let's go watch Georgia smash Penn State next week, right? Like that's what the storyline is going to be. If Notre Dame wins, there's a bit of a seismic shift that says, okay, we now have a new team stepping onto that elite. It doesn't mean Georgia's no longer an elite team. They still are. It just means Notre Dame has now ascended to those heights, in my opinion. And that's what's at stake for the Irish in this game. And for Georgia, it's you want to keep them from getting there because you know what happens on the recruiting trail if Notre Dame finally knocks that door down. I've saying this for years, guys. Teams in the South are scared to death of Notre Dame getting onto that stage and winning because they know what it means for Notre Dame's ability to go down south and start to get some of those guys that they finish second and third for all the time. Now you start getting some of those guys. And that's what 88 did for them. That's what Notre Dame has to prove now. And if you can't, then it's the same. The storyline exists. You're not that team. You're pretty good, but you're like you said it last week. You're one of the best tier 2 teams in college football, but you're not tier 1.
Yeah, I mean Notre Dame's been knocking on the door for years, but this is it. This is the win that they can't just seem to get. And to me, I agree with everything that you said, so I'm not going to rehash it. The other storyline that I love in this one is the coaching matchup. We've been talking all show about the different coaching matchups that are going on. And right now you have, no pun intended, the top dog in Kirby Smart. And I mean, he's at the helm of a program that has won 2 of the 3 last national championships.
Yep.
Right. And last year were held out of the playoffs by their first loss in like 30 games, you know? And so this is it. Like Kirby Smart is the guy. And Marcus Freeman is at the top of the list of ascending head coaches in college football. He just ripped off his 12th ranked win in 3 years. Not a lot of coaches can say that, especially not a lot of coaches at Notre Dame, right? So to me, that's another really interesting storyline. Is it the young head coach, the exciting and energetic Marcus Freeman with probably the best coordinator duo in college football, at the very least one of, you know, can he make it happen? Is he the guy? You know, we're talking a lot about, you know, is Dan Lanning the guy to get him over the hump in Oregon? Can Ryan Day finally eclipse that big game and make it back to the national championship like Urban could for Ohio State? I'm not quite yet on the train with that with Marcus Freeman, but we talk a lot about he's a great coach and we think he's the man for the job, but is he a championship caliber coach? And this is going to really be the first opportunity that we have at this stage, right? Because right now he's kind of batting over. You know, he didn't do it in 22 against Ohio State. He didn't do it in 23 against Ohio State, you know, and before that, he just wasn't the head coach. So that's going to be an interesting narrative going into this game. Like that's going to be another one because, you know, Vince, you said at the start of the show, there's one head coach in all of the playoffs right now that has experience playing in and or winning a national championship. Can Marcus Freeman add his name to that slate?
As a head coach.
Yeah, as a head coach. Like, can he add his name to that very short list of names? And that's going to be another thing. And on the flip side, can Kirby Smart kind of hold that off? Can he kind of be the next gatekeeper in line to keep Notre Dame out of that elite ring of teams? It's going to be a fun one to watch, man. It's going to be fun to watch.
You guys could hear it a little bit in Kirby Smart's comments leading up to the game. You could see that there's a level of respect that he has for Marcus Freeman in this program. And you, because he talked about, I don't really remember those games a whole lot. And he probably doesn't remember those games a whole lot from a standpoint of like the play by play. I mean, they were 2019, 2017. But what I promise you he remembers is those were games where they were battles in the trenches. And at the end of the day, Georgia won those battles. And they were games where Georgia's quarterbacks made more plays in the fourth quarter than Notre Dame's quarterbacks made in the fourth quarter. And that's what this game's going to be about. At the end of the day, guys, Notre Dame's got to prove that they have a quarterback capable of making those game-winning plays. Notre Dame, in each of those two games that they lost, Notre Dame had the football in the fourth quarter with less than 3 minutes to play, where either a field goal in 2017 or a touchdown puts you ahead and wins you the game. And in both times, they never threatened to score in those two games. This game's going to be about. And part of it wasn't just Notre Dame's failures, but Georgia's defensive players stepped up and made the plays. Jake Fromm in each of those games stepped up in the fourth quarter and made big-time throws to win those football games. And Notre Dame's quarterbacks couldn't counter. And I think that's going to very much be a storyline here. You've got a backup quarterback in Gunnar Stockton who has taken, 80 career snaps, and he's going to be behind a very big physical offensive line that averages 316 pounds. In a game where there's going to be times when Howard Cross at 288 pounds is the biggest defensive player that Notre Dame will have on the field. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be a trench game. It's going to be a trench game. Can Notre Dame's defensive line hold up against Georgia's size? Now, no, this is not a very good rushing team from Georgia. It's not. This is a team that rushed for 129 yards a game. But if you follow the season, you'll know that they went through some of the struggles that Notre Dame did early in the season, and that they were not able to get consistency up front because they couldn't get the left tackle figured out. Their starting center missed some time. Drew Bobo had to step in for Wilson there. The Tate Ratledge was banged up for part of the year. This was an offensive line that went through some of the struggles that Notre Dame did, and they weren't able to kind of get rolling like Notre Dame did, but now they've had 3 weeks off to kind of rest their players and get ready for this game and try to go out there and run the football. And now they're going to have a quarterback that like Kirby Smart says something like, hey, Carson Beck's a pretty good athlete too. Yeah, he is, but he's not the runner that Gunnar Stockton is. Gunnar Stockton is a 6'1", 215-pound bowling ball as a runner. And he's a kid that rushed for, I think, a couple thousand yards in high school. He was a very prolific, 4,000 yards in high school, very prolific player in high school. Top No, he doesn't have experience, but this is a kid that you're not putting Pat Dillingham in the game. It's like Carson Beck goes out and you got to put in Pat Dillingham or Nate Montana or, a player like that. You're putting in a kid that was always going to have a chance to eventually be the guy. It's just happening a little bit sooner now. And so this isn't some bum, as we saw in the game. Took them coming out of halftime, took that first drive right down the field and scored a touchdown on Texas. A very good Texas defense. And now he has to face a very good Notre Dame defense. And we're going to find out if he can move the ball. But, so for Notre Dame guys, it's going to be about two things. Number one, on defense, and that's where we'll start. Number one, can you stop the run game? Can you keep Georgia under $150? That to me is the number for me. If you can hold Georgia under $150, you got a shot to win this football game. Well, this is a team that only averages 129. But again, you don't have your best defensive lineman. That's really where this game is at. So let me just go ahead and handle this business here real quick. All right, let's get rid of that nonsense. Handle the line play. You got to hold them under 150. And then the second one is on defense. Can you do enough pre and post snap to cause confusion from Gunnar Stockton without then making yourself vulnerable to big plays. Because that's the double-edged sword when you are disguising coverages and rolling coverages, is sometimes you roll into something that's not what you want to be rolling into, and they've got something called where they're going to put you in a bind. So can you show enough disguising of pressures and coverages and things like that, show like, oh, they're coming. The safeties are down. The linebackers are down. So Gunner's checking hot route, or throwing quick, and all of a sudden you're smoking and you're dropping 7. And then he step in front of a ball. Can you do things like we have seen them do this all year? They did it to Connor Wegman. They did it to Anthony Calandria. They've done it all year where you think I've got a guy open and all of a sudden a safety kind of comes out of nowhere and steps in front of a pass. That's why Notre Dame leads college football in turnovers forced this season. It's why they're a top 10 team in interceptions and have been a very disruptive pass defense for the last 2 years now. It's why they were able to slow down C.J. Stroud. It's why they were able to shut down Drake May. It's why they embarrassed Caleb Williams last year, and I still don't know that Caleb Williams has ever recovered from that game last season. And without making yourself vulnerable to the big plays. Those are, to me, going to be the 2 keys. And of course, the final one is you have to be able to get some level of pressure on Gunnar Stockton. If he's comfortable in the pocket, he will make enough plays to beat you. I think for the Notre Dame defense, those are the keys to having success against Georgia. And for Georgia, it's the opposite. It's run the football, pound Notre Dame into submission, take your play. I think Georgia's going to want to run the ball, screen Notre Dame to death, and take some play action shots down the field. I think that's going to be their game plan, and they've got the speed on the perimeter to have success if Notre Dame plays like they did against USC. Notre Dame's going to have to be disciplined in the secondary and coverage, but also getting pressure. So protect the quarterback, establish the run, and protect the football. Those are the keys for Georgia in this football game from an offensive standpoint.
Trevor, what do you got, brother?
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm in the same boat, Brian. I agree with you. I mean, all those keys. So I don't want to rehash them. The only other thing that I'll add is Notre Dame's defense is going to have to be really fundamentally sound in open field tackling. They're going to do everything that they can to get their players into space. And with Trevor Etienne back healthy because he missed some time with a rib injury, he's a hard runner to bring down. Like, he's not big. I think he's 5'9", right? But he's a really strong runner. He's he's like a stocky guy. He's tough to bring down. And he's more dynamic in the pass game than what Nate Frazier is. And then they also have Dominic Lovett on the outside. He's kind of like their screen guy. He's the guy that they need to get the ball into his hands right away. Arian Smith leads the team in yards, but Dominic Lovett leads the team in receptions. Those two, combined with Dylan Bell, are their threats on the outside. And Arian Smith can absolutely fly.
Yeah.
So that's going to be interesting to see if they can keep everything in front of them without sacrificing being able to stop the run. That, to me, to what Brian said, is going to be a huge key, because that's where it will start to go south. That's where it starts to go south with Notre Dame, is if Georgia is able to start getting those 4 yards, 5 yards, 6 yards. So it's going to be interesting to see if they're going to be able to do that. Yep, exactly.
Over the top.
The only other one that I'm going to add in there is I think the tight ends for Georgia are going to be a difference maker in their offense.
One way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Lawson Lucky and Oscar Delp are 2 dynamic tight ends, and I think they're one of the better tight end duos in the country.
And Ben Urasek starting for a lot of teams.
Mm-hmm.
He's their number 3. I mean, Ben Urasek, their number 3 tight end, caught a 49-yard touchdown pass against Notre Dame in 2021.
Yeah.
Remember that? Caught an in-cut. Actually beat Xavier Watts. It was one of his first games playing DB. But, yeah, I love that observation, Trev, because go back and watch the second half of the Tennessee game.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that broke that game open? They couldn't cover the tight ends.
Yep.
Had a great game plan for the tight ends in the second half, Trev. You're spot on that.
Yeah, Oscar Delp went off against the Vols. So I think he had 4 for 52 and 2 touchdowns. So
I think all of that was in the second half as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to be able to do there, because Notre Dame's linebackers have shown issues at times in coverage. The good is really good. The bad is kind of glaring. And as the season has progressed, they've kind of shorn a lot of that stuff up, but they also haven't played a Georgia caliber type of tight end room. So for Notre Dame's defense, those are the keys for me, is always identify where 7 and 4 are in the tight end room and tackle well in space, because that's going to be huge. Don Schuler is going to be flying down to blow up screen plays in the alley, and he's going to have to bring his feet with him and not come in out of control. So those are my keys on top of what Brian had mentioned.
All right, boys. That's going to do it for our breakdown of the Sugar Bowl And frankly, our breakdown for all 4 bowl games. But, stick around because we're going to have all kinds of coverage, obviously, specifically of the Sugar Bowl coming up, the games in a few different days. And we're going to have post-game coverage of all 4 games. We'll wrap that up as well as our post-game show after the Sugar Bowl is over. And that'll be well into January 2nd, I would imagine, based on the 8:45 start. So
we will be starting on January 2nd.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought.
We will have a post-game show on January 2nd. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. But hey, make sure you stay locked in, everybody at Irish Breakdown. Of course, jump on the boards.irishbreakdown.com. We do have a super chat from Aiden Benami.
Not really a question, just to thank you. He said, "What's on the map today, fellas?" That was at the beginning of the show. So
gotcha.
We kind of went over all that, but I did want to bring that up and thank you for
appreciate you, buddy.
My man, appreciate you very much.
Yep, appreciate you very much. Appreciate that. And like I said, stay locked in, boards.irishbreakdown.com. All kinds of breakdowns are going to be over there. And of course, on irishbreakdown.com as well. All kinds of good stories. Trevor's been putting up some good stuff over there. So make sure you check out irishbreakdown.com. And Brian, he contributes to that.
Well played, Vince. Well played.
Thank you.
And we got a meeting coming up after the show, by the way. Just want to talk.
Vince, if you can hang back after the show.
No, Trevor's been killing it this last week, guys. A lot of great content. Breaking the game down.
Just hang back after the show's over. Yeah, sure, no problem. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share with your family and friends. And like I said, jump on the boards.irishbreakdown.com. There's some practice notes on there. We did have a practice this morning for Notre Dame. And so you want to check that out. Got to get on the boards.irishbreakdown.com. So that's going to do it for our countdown to kickoff for this round of the college football playoff. We will be back to wrap everything up once all those games are played. So if you are watching on the CFB Nation channel, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to that one, hit that notification bell. We're going to be moving forward on that channel here in the very, very close future. So make sure you guys get on board with the CFB Nation channel. There's going to be a lot of good stuff happening over there. So, and of course, subscribe and hit the notification bell on the Irish Breakdown channel as well. So for Trevor, for Brian, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown podcast. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.